To Madeline, his endless hours of editing were not a sacrifice, but a natural resource, as quiet and constant as the flowing tap water. He had spent years standing in the background, polishing the rough edges of her public persona, while she slowly relegated his existence to the shadows of her rising career. On her campaign posters, her smile was radiant and solitary, leaving no room for the man who managed her calendar, answered her late-night emails, and structured her entire platform. He had watched her rehearse her speeches in front of the vanity mirror, her eyes bright with a cold, sharp ambition that seemed to look right through him, treating his corrections as minor annoyances rather than the very foundation of her success. She had become a master of delivery, but she had entirely forgotten who had given her the words. On the afternoon of her anticipated triumph, there was only one final speech left to polish, a draft that required his absolute, silent focus. The keys of the mechanical keyboard made a dull, rhythmic clatter in the small, carpeted study. Julian Vance did not look up from the monitor as the cursor blinked, waiting for the final sentence of paragraph 4. Outside the double-paned window, the automatic sprinklers of Oak Ridge Estates began their 4 o'clock cycle, a rhythmic hiss-click that masked the distant hum of the interstate. He adjusted the brass desk lamp. Its green glass shade cast a warm, narrow pool of light over 3 separate drafts of Madeline's victory speech. Each draft was color-coded with small sticky notes: blue for the moderate crowd at the country club, pink for the local press packet, yellow for the official campaign record. On the corner of the desk sat a half-empty glass of lukewarm tap water, a thin film of dust settling on its surface. Next to it was Madeline's daily schedule, printed on heavy cream paper. Every hour of her day was blocked out in Julian's precise architectural handwriting, from her 7 a.m. dental appointment to the 7:30 p.m. arrival at the grand ballroom of the Whispering Pines Country Club. Julian reached for his silver rollerball pen, the one she had gifted him 4 years ago when she first joined the Homeowners Association board. The silver plating was starting to wear down near the grip, revealing a dull brass undertone. He crossed out the word passionate and replaced it with dedicated. Madeline disliked words with too many syllables when she was speaking to the Northern Precinct voters. They preferred brevity. They preferred a strength that sounded effortless. The heavy oak door of the study swung open without a knock. The scent of jasmine and dry cleaning fluid entered the room before Madeline did. She was already wearing her sapphire blue silk blazer, though the sleeves were pushed up to her elbows. Her hair was held in place by a silver clip, a few stray blonde strands framing her face in a way that her media consultant, Carter, called structured but approachable. "Is the final draft ready?" Madeline asked. She did not look at Julian. Her eyes were fixed on her phone screen, her thumb flicking rapidly as she scrolled through a spreadsheet of projected voter turnout in the 3rd Ward. "Carter says the early numbers from the suburban corridor are higher than we anticipated. We need to make sure the opening remarks address the infrastructure bond." Julian picked up the yellow draft. "It is ready. I streamlined the transition in the 2nd section. You were tripping over the phrasing during last night's rehearsal. It flows better now." Madeline stepped closer to the desk, her high heels clicking sharply on the hardwood border where the area rug ended. She reached out and took the paper from his hand, her movement swift and transactional. She did not say thank you. Her eyes scanned the first page, her brow furrowing slightly. "Why did you cut the line about the community center?" she asked, her voice dropping into the low, measured register she used when she was displeased but trying to maintain her composure. Julian leaned back in his leather chair. The springs groaned softly beneath him. "Because Carter's team failed to secure the endorsement of the construction union on Tuesday, Madeline. If you mention the community center tonight, the local papers will ask about the project budget, and you do not have those figures finalized yet. It is a defensive move." Madeline stared at the paper for a long moment, her thumb still hovering over her phone screen. The device buzzed twice in her palm, a sharp, vibrating rattle that seemed to fill the quiet room. She looked at the screen, then back at the draft. "I suppose you are right," she said, her tone flat, almost grudging. "But I want it back in for the newsletter next week. Make a note of that." Julian did not write anything down. He knew the schedule by heart. He knew the budget by heart. He knew that the newsletter would require 3 different revisions before she approved it, and that she would ultimately take credit for the phrasing during the executive committee meeting. He watched her as she turned toward the mirror on the wall, adjusting the lapel of her blazer. She did not ask how his day had been. She did not ask if he was coming to the venue early to help set up the media riser. She simply assumed he would be there, carrying the spare batteries for the microphones, the printed copies of her biography, and her favorite throat lozenges in his coat pocket. "Carter wants to do a quick run-through of the introduction in the holding room at 7, Madeline said, her back still turned to him. "He thinks we should lead with the personal anecdote about my grandfather's grocery store. It plays well with the older demographic." "That anecdote is in the blue draft," Julian said quietly. "I wrote it specifically for the country club audience. But remember, your grandfather did not actually own the grocery store. He was the assistant manager. If the opposition looks into the property records, they will find the discrepancy." Madeline stopped adjusting her collar. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, a tiny ripple of tension running through her blue blazer. She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze in the mirror's reflection. Her eyes were cool, calculated, and entirely devoid of warmth. "No one is going to look into 70-year-old property records for a local council race, Julian," she said, her voice dropping another octave. "You worry too much about details that do not matter to the voters. Carter says the narrative is what wins, not the footnotes." Julian looked down at his silver pen. The worn brass on the grip felt cold against his fingers. He calculated the energy it would take to explain the difference between a minor oversight and a campaign-ending lie. He thought about the 3 hours he had spent in the county archives on Monday, quietly ensuring that her grandfather's employment history was buried deep enough to avoid casual scrutiny. He decided against saying it. "You are probably right," Julian said, his voice level and dry. Madeline nodded once, satisfied with his compliance. She glanced at her watch, a sleek gold piece that Julian had polished for her that morning. "I have to go. Carter is waiting downstairs in the driveway. We are taking his car to the venue. There are some donors he wants me to meet before the polls close." She did not ask him to join them. She did not offer him a seat in the car. "You will bring the extra copies of the speech?" she asked as she walked toward the door. "Yes," Julian said, "I will bring them." "Do not be late," she added, her hand on the brass doorknob. Carter says the press table needs to be set up by 6:30, or we lose the prime angle for the local news broadcast. The door clicked shut behind her. Julian sat in the silence of the study. The hiss of the sprinklers outside had stopped, replaced by the low, distant hum of Carter's Audi pulling out of the driveway. He looked at the empty desk space where the drafts had been. On the floor, near the edge of the rug, lay a small, crumpled piece of blue paper, a section of the speech he had discarded without reading. He reached down, picked it up, and smoothed it out on the mahogany desk. It was the paragraph where she was supposed to thank her family for their quiet support. The lines he had spent 2 hours drafting to make her sound warm, grounded, and human. He folded the paper twice, precisely, until it was a small square. He did not put it in his pocket. Instead, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, dropped it inside, and slid the drawer closed. The hum of the computer fan was the only sound left in the room. The garage was cool and smelled of gasoline, lawn fertilizer, and old cardboard. Julian lifted the last plastic crate of promotional brochures into the trunk of his dark gray sedan. The hinges of the trunk creaked, a dry, metallic protest that he had been meaning to oil for 3 months. He wiped his palms on his trousers, leaving a faint smudge of cardboard dust near his pocket. Unlike Madeline's leased Porsche, which sat in the other bay when she was home, his car was 10 years old, paid for, and smelled faintly of damp upholstery and the vanilla-scented air freshener he had bought at a car wash 2 winters ago. He climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and waited as the engine coughed once before settling into a low, vibrating idle. He drove slowly through the winding streets of Oak Ridge Estates. The houses here were built to look like colonial estates, with perfectly symmetrical white columns and black shutters that were permanently bolted to the siding, unable to actually close. Every third driveway had a landscaping truck parked in it, the workers blowing grass clippings off the pristine concrete. He passed the gated entrance where the security guard, a retired deputy named Frank, gave him a brief, half-hearted wave. Frank knew Julian as the man who paid the HOA dues on time, while Madeline was the one who argued over the color of the community mailbox trim. The drive to the Whispering Pines Country Club took 20 minutes. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the 2-lane highway. Julian parked in the overflow lot, a gravel patch hidden behind a row of tall arborvitae hedges, to keep the cheaper vehicles out of sight from the main entrance. He rolled up his sleeves, picked up the first 2 heavy boxes of printed speeches and press kits, and walked toward the side entrance of the clubhouse. The service hallway of the country club smelled of burnt garlic, silver polish, and the damp heat of the industrial dishwashers. Julian negotiated the narrow corridor, keeping his shoulders tight to avoid bumping into the banquet staff, who were rushing past with trays of polished water goblets. At the entrance to the grand ballroom, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard blocked his path. She wore a bright pink button with Madeline's name printed in a modern sans serif font. "Deliveries are supposed to go through the loading dock in the back," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. She did not look at his face, her eyes fixed instead on the boxes of campaign literature in his arms. "We are setting up for the private reception right now." "I am Julian Vance," he said quietly. The girl paused, her pen hovering over her clipboard. She blinked, her gaze shifting to his sensible leather shoes, his plain gray trousers, and finally his face. "Oh, the husband. Right. I am sorry, Mr. Vance. Carter said you would be bringing the press packets. You can put them on the long table near the double doors. The media outlets are starting to arrive, and they need the background sheets before the early local news broadcast." She did not offer to help him with the boxes. She simply stepped aside, her attention already returning to her clipboard as she spoke into her headset about a missing tray of stuffed mushrooms. Julian carried the boxes to the designated table. He set them down with a soft thud, his back aching slightly from the awkward carry. He began to unpack the folders, arranging them in neat, overlapping rows. Each folder contained a glossy photo of Madeline, a 2-page biography that he had edited 6 times to emphasize her local roots, and a copy of her platform on suburban zoning reform. From the other side of the ballroom, a sudden burst of laughter echoed over the low murmur of the gathering crowd. Julian looked up. Madeline was standing near the fireplace, surrounded by 3 members of the County Planning Commission and a wealthy local developer named Richard Henderson. She looked radiant under the heavy crystal chandeliers, her sapphire blazer catching the light. She was holding a glass of white wine, her fingers wrapped around the stem with practiced elegance. Standing next to her was Carter Sterling. Carter was 34, possessed a perfect dental smile, and wore a tailored navy suit with a silk pocket square that matched the shade of Madeline's blazer. He was gesturing with his hands as he spoke, his voice carrying easily across the room. "We are looking at a 10-point margin in the Northern Corridor," Carter was saying, his tone dripping with casual confidence. "It is a complete validation of the strategy we built from day one. People wanted professional leadership, and Madeline delivered exactly that." The developer, Henderson, nodded, patting Carter on the shoulder. "Excellent work, Carter. You ran a tight ship. We need more young minds like yours managing these local races. You have a real future in county politics." Madeline smiled, her head tilting back slightly as she took a small sip of her wine. "Carter has been my rock through this entire campaign," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "I do not think we would be standing here tonight without his instincts. He knew exactly how to phrase our message to get the local business community on board." Julian stood by the empty press table, a single glossy folder still in his hand. He looked at the folder, then at the group by the fireplace. He felt no sudden rush of anger, no desire to walk over and interrupt the conversation. Instead, he felt a familiar, cold sensation of energy conservation. He calculated the exact weight of her statement. He thought of the 48 hours he had spent 3 weeks ago rewriting her economic white paper after Carter's draft was ridiculed by a local university professor for containing basic mathematical errors. He thought of the late-night emails he had answered from Henderson's assistant, smoothing over a misunderstanding about land use permits that would have otherwise ended Henderson's financial support of the campaign. He laid the final folder onto the table, aligning its edge perfectly with the others. A local television technician walked up to the table, his shoulder-mounted camera heavy and black. "Hey, buddy," the technician said, pointing toward a power strip under the table. "Is this outlet active? I need to plug in the monitor for the live feed." Julian knelt on the carpet, his knees clicking slightly. He traced the black cord back to the wall outlet, verified the small green light on the surge protector, and looked up at the technician. "Yes," he said, "it is live." "Thanks," the man said, already looking past him toward the podium where Madeline's name was displayed on a large illuminated banner. Julian stood up, brushing a speck of gray carpet lint from his trousers. He looked at his watch. It was 6:45 p.m. The polls would close in 15 minutes. He walked to the back of the room, far from the light of the chandeliers, and stood against the wallpapered wall where the shadows were deepest. He slipped his hands into his pockets, his fingers brushing against the cold metal casing of his silver rollerball pen. By 7 o'clock, the air in the grand ballroom had grown thick and warm, smelling of roasted garlic, melting ice, and the heavy, sweet scent of 20 different brands of expensive cologne. The dual air conditioning units of the country club hummed at maximum capacity, their vents rattling in the high ceiling, but they were no match for the heat of 200 bodies pressed together. Julian remained in his corner near the service doors. From this vantage point, he could watch the entire room without being in anyone's line of sight. He observed the way the local school board members huddled near the bar, their voices rising and falling in rhythm with the free-flowing Pinot Grigio. He watched the real estate agents whispering behind their hands, already calculating the zoning changes that would follow a Vance victory. Above the main bar, 3 large flat-screen televisions were tuned to the local cable news channel. The scroll at the bottom of the screen was stagnant, still showing the afternoon voting percentages, but a red graphic in the corner blinked with the words, "Polls closed." A group of college-age campaign volunteers had gathered around a circular table near the stage, their faces illuminated by the blue light of 3 open laptops. One of them, a tall boy named Tyler, who wore a campaign T-shirt over a button-down shirt, kept refreshing a county election website. "Nothing yet," Tyler called out to Carter, who was standing 5 feet away. "The first batch of absentee ballots should drop any minute." Carter didn't look up from his phone. He was pacing a 5-foot track on the carpet, his leather loafers silent against the thick pile. His tie was slightly loosened, but his hair remained perfectly in place. Madeline stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her knuckles were white, the skin stretched thin over her rings. She was no longer drinking her wine. The glass sat abandoned on a nearby tray, a greasy smudge from her lipstick on the rim. Julian looked at her hands. He knew the pattern of her anxiety. When she was nervous, she would tap her index finger against her thumb in groups of 3. Tap, tap, tap. A silent, frantic rhythm. She was doing it now, her hands held low near her waistline. He knew with absolute certainty that she had nothing to worry about. 3 nights ago, while she slept, Julian had sat at his desk until 3 in the morning, cross-referencing the early mail-in ballot requests with the historical turnout data from the 2022 midterms. He had built a predictive spreadsheet that factored in the rain shower that had passed through the southern precinct at 2 o'clock that afternoon. His model showed her winning by a margin of 8.4%, roughly 1,200 votes. He had tried to show her the spreadsheet on Tuesday morning, but she had waved him away, saying she didn't have time for raw data when she was preparing for her interview with the regional radio station. The room suddenly went quiet as the television screen flashed a bright red breaking news banner. The anchor's voice, amplified by the club's surround sound system, cut through the chatter. "We are now receiving the first major data drop from the county election office," the anchor said, his face professional and blank. "With 40% of precincts reporting, challenger Madeline Vance has taken a commanding lead over the incumbent." The volunteers at the laptop table erupted into a shout. Tyler leaped to his feet, knocking his chair backward onto the carpet. "It is 82% of the mail-in vote," he yelled, his voice cracking with excitement. "Madeline, you are up by 9 points in the Northern Hills." The ballroom exploded into noise. People began to clap, their palms making a wet, heavy sound in the crowded space. Madeline let out a sharp, gasping breath, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Carter. Carter didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight, professional embrace, lifting her slightly off her feet. "We did it, Madeline," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby school board members to hear. "We absolutely nailed the suburban turnout." Julian watched them. He saw the way Madeline's fingers dug into the fabric of Carter's navy blazer. He saw the genuine relief in her eyes, a relief that was quickly replaced by a sharp, glittering ambition. When she stepped back from Carter, her eyes scanned the crowd. For a brief, fleeting second, her gaze passed over Julian, standing in the shadow of the service door. She paused, her smile faltering for a fraction of a millisecond, before she turned to greet the wave of supporters rushing toward her. Richard Henderson was the first to reach her, his heavy hand coming down on her shoulder. "Congratulations, Commissioner Vance. I never doubted you for a second." "Thank you, Richard," Madeline said, her voice rising to cut through the din. "We couldn't have done it without your belief in our vision." Julian did not move from the wall. He watched as 5, 10, 15 people pressed in around her, offering handshakes, cheek kisses, and business cards. He saw Carter standing just behind her shoulder, guiding the local television reporter toward her with a polite, authoritative hand. The young volunteer with the headset, the one who had stopped Julian at the door, hurried over to him. "Mr. Vance," she said, her breath smelling of peppermint and coffee, "we need the yellow draft. Carter says she is going up to the podium in 5 minutes. The local news is going live at 7:30. Julian reached into his leather briefcase, which sat on the floor beside his feet. He pulled out the folder containing the yellow draft, the clean, final copy of her speech. He handed it to the girl. "Here," he said. "Is this the one with the updated infrastructure section?" she asked, already turning to run back to the stage. "Yes," Julian said, "it is the one." He watched her thread her way through the crowd and hand the folder to Carter. Carter opened it, glanced at the first page, and nodded. He walked over to Madeline, tapping her on the arm, and pointed toward the stage. Madeline took the folder from Carter's hand. She did not look around the room for Julian this time. She didn't look to see if the man who had written every word of that speech, the man who had spent his weekends drafting her policy positions and editing her op-eds, was watching. She walked toward the small set of stairs leading to the podium. The stage was decorated with blue and gold balloons, their shiny surfaces reflecting the harsh white glare of the television lights. The banner behind her read, "A New Voice for Oak Ridge." As she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd began to chant her name. "Madeline! Madeline!" Julian reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He looked at the screen. It was 7:28 p.m. He opened his notes app, where he kept a list of all her upcoming speaking engagements, press deadlines, and donor follow-ups. There were 42 items on the list for the coming week alone. He looked up at his wife as she adjusted the microphone, her face perfectly composed under the bright lights. He deleted the first 10 items on the list. The microphone hummed with a brief, high-pitched squeal of feedback that made the crowd in the front row wince. Madeline did not falter. She smiled through it, her hand resting lightly on the metal neck of the stand, until the sound technician at the back of the room adjusted the levels. When she spoke, her voice was warm, confident, and perfectly projected. "Thank you," she said, her tone dropping into the lower, intimate register that Julian had spent 3 weeks helping her practice in their living room. "Thank you all so much." The crowd erupted again, a sea of raised glasses and waving blue and gold signs. Julian stood by the service doors, his shoulder resting lightly against the painted wood frame. He could see the teleprompter screens from this angle, the bright green text scrolling upward in a slow, rhythmic crawl that matched the pace of his own breathing. He had written those words. He had structured the opening paragraph to build a sense of shared community, using short, punchy sentences that allowed Madeline to pause for applause without breaking her momentum. "We did not just win an election tonight," Madeline said, her eyes sweeping across the ballroom, landing on each section of the crowd for exactly 2 seconds. "We reclaimed the future of Oak Ridge. We told the developers, the zoning boards, and the old political machine that our homes, our families, and our neighborhoods are not for sale." A loud cheer rose from the table where Richard Henderson sat. Julian watched the developer clap his hands together, a broad, knowing grin on his face. It was a beautiful irony. Henderson was the largest residential developer in the county, yet he was cheering for a line that Julian had written specifically to pacify the Anti-Development Homeowners Association voters. Julian had assured Madeline that Henderson would understand the theater of it, and indeed, Henderson looked entirely unbothered. As Madeline continued her speech, Julian tracked her performance with a clinical eye. She was doing well. She didn't rush the transition between the education policy and the tax reform section. She paused exactly where he had inserted the paragraph break, letting the gravity of the tax figures sink in before offering her solution. It was his labor, spoken through her mouth, dressed in her blue silk blazer. Then she reached the final page of the yellow draft. Julian knew the text by heart. It was supposed to transition into the personal acknowledgments. He had written a simple, dignified paragraph thanking the campaign staff, followed by a quiet, sincere acknowledgment of their life together, the late nights, the shared sacrifices, the quiet support at home. It was a paragraph designed to make her look grounded, a reminder to the voters that she was a wife and a neighbor before she was a commissioner. Madeline turned the page. The green text on the teleprompter scrolled upward, but she did not read the words on the screen. "When we look back on this campaign," she said, her voice rising with an artificial, practiced warmth that Julian had not coached, "we will remember the long hours, the cold coffee, and the endless door-knocking. But most of all, we will remember the leadership that guided us through the storm." She stopped and looked to her right, her eyes shining under the hot gallery lights. "There is one person in this room who believed in this campaign before anyone else did," she said. "A man whose brilliant strategic mind, tireless work ethic, and absolute devotion to our message made this victory possible." The green text on the prompter had stopped scrolling. The screen was blank. She was ad-libbing now, or rather, She was reading a section that had been prepared outside of Julian's study. "Please join me," Madeline said, her arm extending toward the side of the stage, "in thanking the true architect of this victory, my campaign manager, Carter Sterling." The ballroom exploded into a roar of applause. The young volunteers at the laptop table began to chant Carter's name. Carter stepped forward, his face a perfect picture of modest surprise. He walked up the 3 wooden steps to the stage, his tailored suit catching the light, and stood beside Madeline. She reached out and grasped his hand, raising it in the air like a pair of victorious athletes. The television cameras swiveled to capture the image, the flashbulbs reflecting off the silver buttons of her blazer. Julian did not move. He stood in the shadows, his hands still deep in his pockets. He watched the way Madeline looked at Carter, her eyes bright with a shared, exclusive understanding. He watched the way Carter leaned down to whisper something in her ear, causing her to let out a bright, melodic laugh that was picked up by the microphone. The applause lasted for nearly a full minute. When the noise finally began to die down, Madeline turned back to the microphone. She did not look at the teleprompter. She did not look toward the back of the room where the service doors were. "We have a lot of work to do," she concluded, her voice strong and clear. "And with your support, we are going to start doing it tomorrow morning. Thank you, Oak Ridge, and good night." The band, a local 4-piece jazz group, began to play an upbeat, brassy tune. The crowd surged toward the stage, a wave of dark suits and glittering dresses, eager to be near the new commissioner. Julian stood still. He looked down at the floor where a discarded campaign button lay near his shoe. The blue paint was slightly scratched, showing the cheap tin underneath. He checked his watch. It was 7:42 p.m. A young woman in a waitress uniform squeezed past him, carrying a heavy tray of empty champagne flutes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tired and flat. Julian stepped aside, pressing his back against the wallpaper. He looked at the stage one last time. Madeline was surrounded by a dozen people, her face lost in a sea of congratulations. Carter stood just a foot behind her, his hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward a local news crew. No one looked for Julian. No one came to thank him. No one asked where the man who wrote the speech was standing. He felt a strange, profound sense of weightlessness, as if the gravity of the room had suddenly ceased to apply to him. It was not the sharp sting of betrayal, but rather the quiet, cold clarity of a ledger being balanced. He reached into his pocket, took out his phone, and opened his calendar. At 9 a.m. tomorrow, there was an entry in his handwriting: "Draft response to the Environmental Committee's inquiry on the reservoir project." He tapped the screen. He selected the entry. He pressed delete. The drive back to the empty house in Oak Ridge Estates was silent. Julian did not turn on the radio. The only sound in the car was the dry whir of the dashboard fan blowing lukewarm air against his face, and the steady, rhythmic thump of the tires passing over the expansion joints of the concrete highway. He parked his sedan in the garage, turned off the ignition, and sat in the dark for a long minute. The engine block ticked softly as it began to cool, a series of tiny metallic pings in the enclosed space. He got out, closed the car door with a quiet click, and walked into the kitchen. The house was cold. The smart thermostat had automatically lowered the temperature to 68 degrees for the evening, as programmed by his own phone calendar 3 months ago. The stainless steel appliances in the kitchen cast long, silver reflections on the dark granite countertops. On the kitchen island sat a single white ceramic bowl containing 3 decorative artificial green apples, their polished surfaces catching the faint light from the microwave clock. Julian did not turn on the overhead lights. He moved through the dark kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who had lived in the same space for 12 years. He filled a small metal kettle with tap water and set it on the stove, turning the burner until a circle of blue flame hissed to life beneath it. He sat at the kitchen island, his hands flat against the cold stone surface. He waited. The kettle began to sing, a low, breathy whistle that grew into a sharp, piercing whine. He turned off the flame just before the sound reached its peak. He poured the steaming water into a heavy clay mug containing a single bag of chamomile tea, watching the hot water turn a pale golden yellow. It was 11:40 p.m. when the headlights of a car swept across the kitchen windows, throwing sharp, moving shadows of the backyard maple tree against the white walls. Julian did not look toward the window. He listened to the sound of the engine idling in the driveway, the deep, throaty purr of Carter's Audi. The engine ran for another 30 seconds before it was switched off. Then came the sound of a car door closing, followed by the light, hurried click of high heels on the concrete walk. The front door unlocked with a heavy electronic beep. Madeline stepped into the foyer. She was laughing, her voice high and slightly breathless. "Good night, Carter," she called out to the driveway, before closing the door and throwing the deadbolt. She leaned her back against the door for a second, her eyes closed, a wide, lingering smile on her face. Her sapphire blazer was unbuttoned, and her hair was slightly loose, a few strands falling over her shoulders. She smelled of cold night air, expensive champagne, and the sharp chemical tang of the smoke machines they had used near the stage. She opened her eyes and saw Julian sitting at the kitchen island in the dark. "Oh," she said, her smile dropping slightly, replaced by a momentary look of surprise. "You are still up. Why are you sitting in the dark?" "I was having some tea," Julian said quietly. He took a slow sip from his mug. The hot liquid burned his tongue slightly, but his face remained expressionless. Madeline kicked off her high heels, letting them clatter against the hardwood floor of the entryway. She walked into the kitchen on her stockinged feet, her steps slightly uneven from the champagne. She reached into the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, and twisted the cap off with a sharp click. "My God, Julian," she said, leaning against the counter and taking a long drink. Tonight was absolutely incredible. The turnout was historic. The regional news anchor told Carter that my speech was the most cohesive, polished platform statement he had heard in a local race in 10 years. She set the bottle down, her eyes wide with excitement. "They are already talking about the state assembly race in 2 years, she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "Carter says if we maintain this momentum, if we keep the business community happy with the zoning reforms, we will have the entire county committee locked down by next spring." Julian watched her. He observed the flush on her cheeks, the way she gestured with her hands, the absolute certainty in her voice. She spoke of her future as if it were a train already running on tracks that had been laid down by some invisible, natural force. "That is great, Madeline," he said, his voice level and flat. She didn't notice his lack of enthusiasm. She was too busy scrolling through her phone again, her face illuminated by the bright screen. "We have a breakfast meeting with the Environmental Committee at 8 tomorrow morning," she said, her thumb moving rapidly. "Carter wants to release our official response to the reservoir project right after the breakfast. He says it will preempt the opposition's press conference." She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to focus through her fatigue. "You have that draft ready, right?" she asked, her voice dropping into her business tone. "The one about the water runoff standards? I need to print it out before we leave. Carter wants to review it in the car." Julian looked down at his tea. The tea bag had settled to the bottom of the mug, its string hanging limply over the side. "I managed the files this evening," Julian said. "Perfect," she said, turning toward the stairs. "I am absolutely exhausted. My feet are killing me. Make sure you print 3 copies of the draft and leave them on the counter by the keys. And we need some of those small water bottles from the pantry for the car. Carter likes the brand with the blue labels." She walked out of the kitchen, her stockinged feet sliding softly against the hard wood. Julian listened as her steps moved up the stairs, followed by the sound of her bedroom door closing. The house fell silent again. Julian sat at the island for another 10 minutes. The tea in his mug had gone lukewarm. He stood up, poured the remaining liquid into the stainless steel sink, and watched it swirl down the drain. He rinsed the mug with cold water, dried it with a linen towel, and placed it back in the cupboard, aligning it perfectly with the other mugs. He walked into his study. He did not turn on the computer. He simply stood by the desk, looking at the silver rollerball pen resting on the green blotter. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., the Environmental Committee would expect a detailed 20-page technical response regarding the reservoir runoff. Without it, the committee's chairman, an old-school conservationist who had voted for Madeline only after Julian had spent 3 Saturdays drinking bad coffee in his workshop, would assume she had lied about her commitments. He would assume she was just another developer-friendly politician with no interest in the local watershed. Julian picked up his silver pen, slid it into his shirt pocket, and turned off the desk lamp. The room went black. The 6:15 a.m. sunlight cut through the slats of the white plantation shutters in the kitchen, casting long, zebra-like stripes of yellow light and dark shadow across the hardwood floor. Julian stood by the stove. The kitchen was exceptionally quiet, save for the low, rhythmic ticking of the toaster oven as it warmed a single slice of rye bread. A small pot of water simmered on the burner, tiny silver bubbles clinging to the bottom of the stainless steel before rising to break the surface. With a smooth, practiced motion, Julian cracked a single egg into a small cup, then slid it gently into the swirling water. He did not prepare a second egg. He did not set out a second plate. On the granite kitchen island, his breakfast sat waiting: a single plate, a butter knife, a small dish of sea salt, and a mug of black coffee, the steam rising in a thin, lazy spiral toward the range hood. At 7 o'clock, the heavy, hurried footsteps sounded on the stairs. Madeline appeared in the doorway, her light gray pantsuit sharp and wrinkle-free, though her silk blouse was only half-buttoned. She was holding a leather portfolio under one arm while trying to fasten a silver pearl earring with her free hand. Her phone was wedged between her shoulder and her ear. "No, Carter, I understand," she said into the phone, her voice tight and rapid. "I know the local television crew will be there at 8:30. I just need to grab the paperwork. I am leaving the house in 5 minutes." She dropped her portfolio onto the counter. It slid 3 inches, stopping just short of Julian's coffee mug. She did not look at him. She dropped her shoulder, catching her phone in her hand as she hung up, then immediately scanned the kitchen island. Her eyes darted to the empty space next to the keys. "Julian, where are the folders?" she asked, her voice carrying a sharp edge of early morning impatience. "I told you to leave the 3 printed copies of the reservoir runoff response right here by my keys." Julian took a small wooden spoon and lifted the poached egg from the water, letting it drain for a second before placing it onto his rye toast. He sprinkled a pinch of sea salt over the top. "I didn't print them," he said. His voice was quiet, even, and entirely devoid of apology. Madeline stopped mid-motion, her hand still holding her second earring. She stared at him, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What do you mean you didn't print them? I explicitly told you last night that Carter needed to review the draft in the car on the way to the breakfast. It is 7:15. We have 45 minutes before we have to face Chairman Miller." "I did not complete the revisions," Julian said. He picked up his fork and cut into the egg, watching the warm yolk spread across the dark bread. Madeline let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You didn't complete them? Julian, it is a 20-page technical brief. We have been talking about this deadline for 2 weeks. What have you been doing all evening?" Julian chewed his toast slowly, appreciating the crunch of the crust. He swallowed, then looked up to meet her gaze. Her face was flushed, a tiny vertical line appearing between her eyebrows, the first sign of a headache she would complain about later. "I was tired," Julian said. "I went to bed at 10. Madeline stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. The silence stretched between them, marked only by the low hum of the refrigerator. In 12 years of marriage, Julian had never told her he was too tired to complete a task she had assigned him. He had stayed up through bouts of the flu to write her HOA newsletters. He had drafted her campaign bio while nursing a sprained wrist. She rubbed her temples, her fingernails clicking against her forehead. "Okay, fine," she said, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to control her frustration. "Just give me the laptop. I will print the draft we had from yesterday afternoon. Carter and I can fix the runoff equations in the car. It is better than showing up empty-handed." "The draft from yesterday afternoon is no longer in the shared folder," Julian said, taking a sip of his coffee. "What?" Madeline's voice cracked. "Why would you delete it?" "Because the equations in that draft were incorrect," Julian said, his tone conversational. "If you had presented those figures to Chairman Miller, he would have realized within 5 minutes that your proposed environmental standards would allow twice the legal limit of phosphorus into the local watershed. He would have called a press conference of his own to expose the discrepancy. I removed the unverified file to protect the campaign from a public relations disaster." "Then where is the corrected version?" Madeline demanded, her hands flat on the island, leaning toward him. "It does not exist," Julian said. "I did not write it." Madeline's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of a joke, some indication of anger, or a petty grievance she could easily address with a quick apology or a promise to make it up to him later. But Julian's face was a perfect, placid lake. He looked like a man explaining the weather. Her phone began to vibrate violently on the granite counter, the buzzing sound loud and jarring in the quiet kitchen. The screen lit up with Carter's name. She did not answer it. "Julian," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly, "you are ruining my morning. This breakfast is with the entire Conservation Committee. If I do not have those technical sheets, I am going to look like an amateur who does not understand her own platform." Carter built this entire week's press strategy around this response. "Then you should call Carter," Julian said, picking up his butter knife to scrape a small smudge of egg yolk from his plate. "He is the strategist." The phone stopped vibrating, then immediately began to buzz again. Madeline snatched the phone off the counter, her thumb swiping the screen with aggressive force. "Carter," she said, her voice instantly shifting into a professional, controlled tone as she turned her back to Julian. "I am on my way out the door. No, we have a minor technical delay with the printed materials." Julian had to recalculate some of the watershed metrics to ensure absolute accuracy. Yes, I know. I will see you in 5 minutes." She hung up, her shoulders rigid. She turned back to Julian, her eyes cold. "We will talk about this tonight," she said, her voice dropping into a low, threatening hiss. "This is completely unacceptable, Julian. You know how much is riding on this week. If this breakfast goes sideways, it is on you." She grabbed her leather portfolio, her keys, and her high heels from the floor. She did not look at him again as she rushed out the front door, slamming it behind her. The heavy thud of the wood frame vibrated through the kitchen walls, causing the green glass shade of the study lamp down the hall to rattle softly. Julian sat alone in the quiet kitchen. He took his time finishing his coffee. When the cup was empty, he stood up, carried his plate and mug to the sink, and washed them thoroughly with warm water and soap. He dried them and put them away in their designated cabinets. He walked into his study, sat at his desk, and opened his laptop. He did not open the campaign folder. Instead, he opened a private spreadsheet he had created several years ago, a detailed accounting of their shared bank accounts, the equity in the Oak Ridge house, and the title deeds to their vehicles. He began to copy the financial data into a clean, encrypted document on a separate drive. From the street outside, the distant sound of a car horn echoed through the trees. Carter, waiting at the corner for Madeline to catch up. Julian did not look out the window. By 10:30 in the morning, the high-end quiet of Oak Ridge Estates had settled into its midday lull. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of a roofing hammer 3 streets over, and the dry hum of the central air conditioning unit pushing cool, filtered air through the vents of Julian's study. Julian sat at the dining room table, surrounded by 3 weeks of unopened mail. Usually this task was part of his Sunday afternoon routine, a quiet hour spent with a letter opener, a garbage bin, and his online banking portal. He would sort, file, and pay every bill before Madeline even realized they had arrived. He would draft polite, apologetic emails to the Homeowners Association board whenever a campaign yard sign violated the community bylaws. He would schedule the maintenance for her Porsche, dispute the incorrect charges on her campaign credit card, and file the tax exemptions for their home. Today, he did not use his silver letter opener. He used his fingers, tearing the envelopes with a slow, deliberate tear that left jagged white edges. The first letter was a notice from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. The blue ink on the cream paper was polite but firm. It was a warning regarding the oversized vinyl victory banner that Carter's volunteers had hung over their garage door the previous evening. According to Section 4 of the Neighborhood Charter, political advertisements were restricted to standard yard signs not exceeding 2 feet by 2 feet. The fine was $50 per day for noncompliance, beginning at noon today. Julian read the letter twice. Normally, he would have called the HOA president, a retired structural engineer named Harold, who played golf on Tuesdays, and resolved the issue with a brief, friendly conversation. He would have climbed the ladder himself, taken the banner down, and folded it neatly in the garage before Madeline ever saw the notice. He laid the letter in the middle of the dining table. He did not call Harold. He did not fetch the ladder from the garage. The second envelope was a statement from the luxury dealership where Madeline leased her Porsche Cayenne. The monthly payment was $1,200, auto-drafted from their joint savings account. The statement also included a separate invoice for a minor body repair, a $300 charge for buffing out a scrape on the rear passenger door where she had backed into a concrete pillar at a donor's estate 3 weeks ago. Julian looked at the statement. The joint savings account was funded primarily by his freelance copy editing and research contracts, as Madeline's campaign had consumed the entirety of her salary for the past 8 months. He logged into the banking app on his phone. He did not pay the invoice. Instead, he transferred his personal savings, $34,000, accumulated over 5 years of quiet, late-night editing work, into a newly opened individual account at a different regional bank. He left exactly enough in the joint account to cover the mortgage and the basic utility bills for the coming month. He did not authorize the automatic transfer for the Porsche lease. At 11:15, his phone began to vibrate against the polished mahogany of the table. The screen lit up with Madeline's contact photo, a professional headshot where she was smiling, her eyes bright and inviting. Below her name, the words "mobile call" flashed in rhythm with the vibration. Julian did not pick up the phone. He watched the device slide a fraction of an inch across the smooth wood, driven by its own motor, until the call timed out and went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Carter. "Julian, where are you? Madeline is in a meeting with the county treasurer, and we need the specific budget spreadsheets for the road widening project. She says you have the local municipal bond amortization schedule on your hard drive. Send it now. It is urgent." Julian did not reply. He closed the message window and opened his email inbox. There was a new message from Madeline, sent 40 minutes earlier. The subject line was simply, "Runoff breakfast." "Julian," the email read. The breakfast was a complete mess. Chairman Miller was incredibly hostile. He asked me direct questions about the 3-stage filtration system for the reservoir. And because I did not have your technical notes, I had to rely on Carter's talking points. Carter did not know that the local water district had updated their baseline metrics last month. Miller called me out in front of the entire committee. He asked if I had even read my own environmental platform. I looked completely unprepared. Carter is trying to spin it with a local reporter who was in the room, but we need those sheets immediately to send as a follow-up. Please find the backup copy on your computer and email it to my campaign address. Do not ignore this." Julian read the email. He could hear her voice in the text, the high, sharp panic masked as executive authority, the subtle shift from asking to demanding. He clicked on his document folder. He found the file labeled reservoir _ runoff _ final _ draft. It was a meticulously researched 22-page document containing 3 years of local water quality data, complete with charts, graphs, and a detailed legal analysis of the county's regulatory authority. It was, without a doubt, the strongest piece of policy work her campaign had ever produced. Julian clicked the file. He dragged it to the trash bin on his desktop. He clicked empty trash. The computer made a small digital crunching sound, confirming the permanent deletion of the data. His phone buzzed again. A voicemail notification appeared. Julian pressed his phone to his ear, listening to the recorded message. Madeline's voice was tight, her breathing shallow. He could hear the background noise of a busy restaurant, the clatter of plates, the murmur of affluent voices, the sharp, artificial laugh of Carter in the distance. "Julian," she said, her whisper fierce and strained. "Answer your phone. I know you are at home. Stop being childish about this morning." I apologized, or rather, I told you how important this is. We are at the Country Club Grill right now trying to salvage the relationship with the Environmental Committee, and I need that file. If you do not send it in the next 10 minutes, I am going to have to drive back to the house myself and get it. Just send the email. Julian hung up. He set the phone back on the table. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a fresh glass of cold tap water, and stood by the window. In the backyard, a gray squirrel was perched on the wooden bird feeder he had built 3 summers ago, busily knocking sunflower seeds onto the grass below. He took a slow, deliberate drink of his water. He felt no anger, no satisfaction, no rush of adrenaline. There was only the quiet, heavy stillness of a man watching a complex machine slowly grind itself to a halt because someone had forgotten to oil the gears. He picked up his keys from the counter. He walked out of the house, locked the front door behind him, and climbed into his gray sedan. He was going to a small, quiet diner 3 towns over, a place where they served mediocre coffee and excellent blueberry pie, and where nobody had ever heard the name Madeline Vance. The diner was called the Bluebird, located 30 miles north of Oak Ridge Estates, in a valley where the houses were still made of wood and the yards were filled with rusted tractors rather than manicured hydrangeas. It smelled of yellow onions, scorched lard, and weak coffee that had been sitting in a glass pot for too long. Julian sat in a booth with a cracked red vinyl seat, his back to the grease-filmed window. He had ordered a slice of blueberry pie and a glass of cold water. He ate slowly, cutting each bite into a perfect square with his fork. The pie was too sweet, the crust soggy, but he appreciated the complete lack of expectation in the room. Nobody here knew his name. Nobody cared about the county commission race or the regional water runoff metrics. The waitress, an older woman with a faded blue apron and a silver name tag that read Martha, had only spoken 3 words to him: hot or iced. He stayed in the booth for nearly 2 hours, long after his plate was clean. He did not look at his phone. It sat in his pocket, silent, though he could feel the faint, high-frequency vibration of incoming text messages every 10 minutes. It was nearly 3 o'clock when he drove back into Oak Ridge Estates. As he turned onto his street, he saw Madeline's silver Porsche Cayenne parked at an awkward, diagonal angle in the driveway. One of her rear tires was resting on the grass, leaving a deep, muddy track in the pristine turf. The oversized blue and gold victory banner was still hanging over the garage door, its bottom corner fluttering in the warm afternoon breeze. Julian parked his sedan on the street, leaving the driveway entirely to her. He walked up the concrete path, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the foyer. The house was not quiet. From down the hall, the sound of drawers being opened and slammed shut echoed through the high ceiling. A heavy thud followed, like a book being dropped onto the floor. Julian walked slowly toward his study. The room was in complete disarray. Madeline had dragged his metal filing cabinet away from the wall, leaving deep black gouges in the oak floorboards. The drawers were pulled out to their limits, with yellow folders and white papers scattered across the green desk blotter and the area rug. Her expensive leather handbag lay on the floor, its contents, lipstick, a compact mirror, gold pens, and a half-empty packet of throat lozenges, spilled across the hardwood. She was sitting in his leather desk chair, her face pale and her hair loose, her fingers typing frantically on his mechanical keyboard. The monitor cast a harsh blue glow over her sweating face. Julian stood in the doorway, his hands loose in his pockets. "You should not have dragged the filing cabinet," he said, his voice quiet. "It scratches the wood." Madeline jumped, her shoulders jerking upward as she let out a sharp, ragged breath. She turned in the chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Where were you?" she screamed, her voice cracking. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the edges of the desk. "I have been calling you for 3 hours. I drove all the way back here from the country club. The county executive called me twice, Julian. He wanted the municipal bond amortization schedule for the road project, and I couldn't find it anywhere." "I was having lunch," Julian said. "Lunch?" Madeline stood up, her high heels grinding into a paper folder on the floor. "You went to lunch while my career is imploding? I am trying to log into your computer to get the file, but the password is not working. I tried my birthday, I tried our anniversary, I tried the day we bought this house. What did you change it to?" "I updated my network security," Julian said. He did not move from the doorway. He did not look at the papers on the floor. "It is a standard protocol for my freelance clients. Their legal departments require a 15-character, randomly generated password updated every 90 days. "Then type it in," she demanded, gesturing wildly at the screen. "Type it in right now so I can get the file and send it to Carter. The treasurer is waiting for our response. We are supposed to have a press briefing at 4:30. "I cannot do that," Julian said. Madeline froze. Her mouth remained slightly open, her chest rising and falling rapidly under her gray silk blouse. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" "I cannot give you access to my workstation," Julian said, his tone flat and reasonable. "My contracts with the corporate edit clients include strict non-disclosure agreements. If I allow an unauthorized user to access the machine, even my spouse, I am in breach of contract. They can terminate my retainer immediately and sue for damages." "Julian," she whispered, her voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet hiss. "I am your wife. This is my campaign. Our entire financial future depends on this commission seat. If I fail this week, if the county executive thinks I am incompetent, we lose everything. Do you understand that? I do not care about your little editing contracts. This is real power, Julian. This is my life." Julian made a silent calculation. He estimated the total value of her campaign contributions, the cost of her leased Porsche, the mortgage on this 5-bedroom house, and the $50 daily fine from the HOA that was currently accumulating on their garage door. He compared it to the $34,000 he had quietly moved to his private account this morning. He felt no fear. He felt no urge to protect her. "My editing contracts paid for the deposit on your Porsche, Madeline," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "They pay 60% of the mortgage on this house. They are not little." Madeline's face went red, then a strange, sickly gray. She stepped closer to him, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "Are you doing this on purpose?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is this because of the speech last night? Because I didn't mention you? Is that what this childish tantrum is about?" Julian looked at her. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the way she was trying to find the leverage point, the emotional wound she could squeeze to make him comply. She thought this was a domestic dispute, a standard husband and wife argument about appreciation and hurt feelings that could be solved with a tearful apology or a hollow promise of a vacation. She did not understand that the machine had already stopped. "I did not write the speech to be thanked, Madeline," he said, and for the first time a small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I wrote it to be effective. And it was." "Then help me," she cried, her voice cracking with a sudden, desperate vulnerability that sounded entirely manufactured. "Please, Julian, just give me the bond schedule. I will make it up to you, I swear. We will go away for the weekend, just Carter, you, and me. We can sit down and talk about how to integrate you more into the official staff. You can have a title. We can pay you a consultant fees from the campaign funds." Julian looked past her to the window. Outside, a luxury sedan was pulling up to the curb. It was Carter's Audi. The car door opened, and Carter stepped out, his phone already glued to his ear, his face tense as he looked at the diagonal Porsche in the driveway. "Your manager is here," Julian said, stepping aside to clear the doorway. "You should probably go out and meet him. He looks worried." Madeline looked at the door, then back at Julian, her face contorted in a mask of pure, helpless frustration. She grabbed her leather bag from the floor, shoving the fallen lipstick and pens inside with clumsy, frantic movements. "You are going to regret this, Julian," she said, her voice shaking as she brushed past him, her shoulder hitting his with a hard, intentional bump. Julian did not flinch. He walked into a study, picked up the yellow folders from the floor, and began to stack them in perfect alphabetical order on his desk. The wooden cutting board made a steady, hollow thud against the granite counter as Julian sliced a clove of garlic. He held the blade of the chef's knife flat, pressing down with the heel of his palm to crush the cloves first, releasing the sharp, sulfurous aroma into the warm kitchen. In the living room, 30 feet away, the voices were rising in pitch, thin and frayed with exhaustion. "We can't just delay it again, Carter," Madeline said, her voice sounding dry, as if she had been speaking for hours without water. "The local radio station has already run the segment about the environmental breakfast. They are calling it a major policy gap. If we postpone the 4:30 press briefing until tomorrow, it looks like we are hiding from the water board." Carter's response was lower, a hurried, rhythmic murmur that Julian could only catch in fragments. "Manage the narrative. Say the numbers are being audited. Greg from the daily paper is already asking questions about the developer funding. We need the bond schedule to prove the county is matching the infrastructure costs." Julian swiped the chopped garlic into a small glass bowl. He reached for a yellow onion, peeled back the papery outer skin, and began to make vertical cuts with the tip of his knife. The skin of the onion hissed softly under the blade. A shadow fell across the kitchen entrance. Julian did not look up. He continued to slice, his thumb tucked back, his knuckles guiding the flat of the steel blade with rhythmic precision. "Julian," Carter said. Carter had taken off his navy blazer. It was draped over the back of a dining chair, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He had a gold pen tucked behind his ear, and his eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark, violet-tinted circles of fatigue. He was trying to smile, but the muscles around his mouth were tight, twitching slightly at the corners. "Julian, buddy," Carter said, stepping into the kitchen. He leaned against the marble island, crossing his arms in a gesture meant to convey casual, man-to-man familiarity. "Can we talk for a second?" "The garlic in the pan," Julian said, his voice quiet. "The oil is getting hot." He picked up a bottle of extra virgin olive oil, poured a thin green circle into the stainless steel skillet, and turned the burner dial. The blue flame hissed to life. "Look," Carter said, his voice dropping into the low, persuasive tone he used when buttering up local precinct captains. "I know there's some tension here. I get it. This campaign has been a grind for everyone. We've all been operating on 3 hours of sleep, and sometimes things get lost in the shuffle. Madeline is under an immense amount of pressure right now. She's the face of the movement. But we are a team, right? You, me, Madeline. We all want the same thing." Julian slid the sliced onions into the pan. They immediately began to sizzle, a gentle popping sound that filled the silence. He picked up a wooden spoon and began to stir them, watching the white pieces turn translucent under the oil. "What is it you want, Carter?" Julian asked. Carter chuckled, a brief, dry sound. "Well, right now I want to save our candidate from looking like she doesn't know her own budget. The county executive is hosting a private dinner at 6, and he needs to know we have the municipal bond amortization schedule locked down. Madeline says you have the only copy on your external drive. I just need you to drag that file onto a thumb drive for me. 5 seconds. That is all it takes." The schedule was prepared using the county treasurer's public database from 2 years ago, Julian said, his eyes fixed on the onions. "I spent 40 hours correcting the interest rate projections because the treasurer's office used a static 3% inflation model. If you use their raw data, the project will run $5 million over budget by year 3. "Exactly," Carter said, his eyes lighting up as he tapped his fingers on the marble counter. "That is exactly why we need your version, Julian. You're the numbers guy. You're the anchor. We need that corrected schedule so we can hand it to the executive and prove we've done the homework. My contract is with Madeline Vance, Julian said, his voice level and cool. Not with the campaign, not with you. Carter's smile faltered. The charm began to slip away, revealing the hard, defensive ego beneath. Julian, don't be like this. We are talking about a local council seat that opens the door to the state capitol. If Madeline wins this, she has leverage. If she loses, she is just another suburban housewife who tried to run for office and failed because she couldn't manage her own paperwork. Is that what you want? To see her fail? Julian turned the burner down to a low simmer. He picked up a pinch of sea salt and let it rain down over the onions, watching the crystals dissolve into the oil. He made a silent calculation of Carter's career trajectory. Carter was a contract manager. He was paid a monthly retainer by the state party with a substantial bonus if his candidate won. If Madeline's campaign collapsed in a series of administrative scandals before she even took office, Carter's reputation as a rising star in the party would be dead. He would be relegated to managing school board races in the western counties. You are worried about your bonus, Carter, Julian said quietly. Carter's jaw tightened. A sharp red flush rose from his collar, coloring his neck. That is out of line, Julian. I care about this community. I care about Madeline's future. Then you should have checked the water runoff metrics before the environmental breakfast, Julian said. You should have verified the interest rates before you promised the county executive a balanced budget on the road project. That is what a campaign manager does. Julian! Madeline's voice rang out from the living room, sharp and raw. Her high heels began to click across the hardwood. She entered the kitchen, her face pale, her phone held in her hand like a weapon. The HOA president is on the phone, she said, her voice shaking with anger. Harold. He says there is a $50 daily fine starting today because of the victory banner over the garage. He said he sent a letter to the house this morning. Why didn't you tell me? Why is that banner still up? I put the letter on the dining table, Julian said. It is next to the electric bill. Why didn't you take it down? Madeline yelled, stepping between Carter and the island. You know the rules. You always handle the HOA stuff. Julian picked up his glass of water and took a small, measured sip. I do not have a ladder, he said. You do have a ladder, she screamed. It is in the garage. It has been in the garage for 5 years. The garage is your space, Julian said, his voice remaining perfectly calm, his posture relaxed. You park your Porsche there. I do not use the garage. Madeline stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between him and the sizzling onions on the stove. She looked completely disoriented, like a person who had walked into her own home only to find all the furniture rearranged and the doors locked from the inside. Carter reached out and laid a hand on her arm, his voice dropping into his professional crisis management register. Madeline, calm down. We don't have time for this. The county executive is calling back in 10 minutes. We have to make a decision about the dinner. He looked at Julian, his eyes cold and venomous. We don't need him, Carter said to her, though his eyes never left Julian's face. We will use the treasurer's raw database. We will tell the executive that the updated interest rates are being finalized by our financial committee next week. We will spin it." Madeline looked at Julian, her bottom lip trembling slightly, a mixture of fury and fear in her expression. She wanted him to argue. She wanted him to yell back so she could use her anger to crush his resistance. But Julian only stood there, holding his wooden spoon, smelling of garlic and onions, looking entirely at peace. "Fine," she whispered, "fine. Let's go, Carter. We are leaving." She turned and marched toward the front door. Carter lingered for a second, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Julian. "You are making a massive mistake, Vance," Carter said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet threat. "When she is in office, you won't have any say in how things are run. You're turning yourself into a spectator in your own life." Julian did not answer. He turned his back to Carter, picked up the bowl of crushed garlic, and slid it into the hot skillet. The front door slammed shut. The house went silent again. Julian stood by the stove, stirring the garlic as it began to turn a light golden brown. He looked at his watch. It was 5:15 p.m. The county executive's dinner was at 6. The drive to the executive's estate took 45 minutes. If they had left just now, they would be 10 minutes late, even if Carter drove 80 miles an hour in his Audi. Julian smiled, a tiny, quiet line of satisfaction crease-marking his face, and reached for the pasta. By 9:45 p.m., the temperature in the house had dropped to 67 degrees. Julian sat in the high-backed armchair in his study, the only light in the room coming from the brass floor lamp beside him. He was reading an old, leather-bound volume on local municipal history, the pages thick and smelling of dry cedar and vinegar. On the desk, his cup of black tea had gone cold, a dark, motionless circle of liquid reflecting the green glass shade of the desk lamp. The low, familiar rumble of Carter's Audi sounded in the driveway. Julian did not turn his head. He listened to the engine idle for a few seconds, then cut out. A car door opened and closed. There were no voices this time, no laughter, no confident chatter trailing up the concrete walkway, just the heavy, dragging sound of a single pair of feet approaching the front door. The electronic deadbolt clicked open with its signature 3-tone beep. Madeline stepped into the foyer. She did not throw her keys onto the marble console table as she usually did. Instead, she set them down with a quiet, metallic clink. She didn't call out his name. She walked slowly down the hallway, her high heels dangling from her fingers by their thin leather straps. Her bare feet made a soft, whispering sound against the cold oak floorboards. She stopped in the doorway of the study. The blue silk of her blazer was wrinkled, and the pearl earring on her left ear was missing, leaving only a tiny red pinch mark on her lobe. Her eyes were dull, rimmed with gray, and her mouth was set in a tight, thin line of complete physical and mental exhaustion. Julian did not close his book. He kept his finger marked between the pages and looked up at her, his expression neutral. "Did you save any dinner?" she asked. Her voice was flat, hollow, and barely louder than a whisper. "I made enough for one," Julian said. Madeline looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes drifted past him to the kitchen down the hall, where the countertops were spotless, the stainless steel pans dried and put away, and the stove completely dark. For years, no matter how late she returned from a committee meeting or a fundraising dinner, There had always been a plate waiting for her under a sheet of aluminum foil, kept warm in the oven at low heat. There had always been a glass of water with 2 lemon slices sitting on the counter. Tonight, there was nothing. She walked into the study, her bare feet pressing into the thick pile of the area rug. She sank into the small velvet sofa opposite his chair, her knees pulling up toward her chest as she wrapped her arms around herself. She looked small in the oversized sapphire jacket, the fabric swallowing her frame. "Higgins didn't buy the spin," she said. She was staring at the empty fireplace, her voice dropping into a dull, repetitive rhythm. Carter tried to tell him that the interest rate projections were being finalized by our Treasury consultants. Higgins just sat there. He didn't even touch his steak. He looked at Carter, then he looked at me, and he said, "Madeline, if you don't know the difference between a static 3% model and a dynamic amortization schedule, you have no business managing a $60 million infrastructure budget." She let out a short, dry breath that sounded like a cough. He told us that if the corrected schedule isn't on his desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow, he's going to publicly endorse the independent audit proposal. If he does that, the local papers will run it on the front page of the morning edition. It will look like I am hiding a $5 million deficit before I even take the oath of office. Julian watched her. He noted the slight tremble in her lower lip, the way her shoulders slumped forward, the complete absence of the polished, dominant persona she had cultivated over the past year. She was no longer the rising political star of Oak Ridge Estates. She was a tired woman who had built her entire house on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in. "That sounds like a difficult position," Julian said quietly. "It is a disaster, Julian," she said, her voice rising slightly, though she didn't have the energy to scream. "If Higgins pulls his support, the whole platform falls apart. The developers will back out. The zoning committee will stall the transitions. Carter says we might even face an ethics inquiry if the opposition claims we intentionally misled the donors about the infrastructure costs." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes wide, pleading, and dark with a desperate, sudden hope. "You have the file, Julian. I know you do. You spent weeks on it. Just give me the thumb drive, or email it to Higgins directly. You don't even have to talk to me. Just send it to his office. Tell him it was a clerical delay. He respects you. He knows you are the one who actually handles the municipal policy. If it comes from you, he will accept it." Julian slowly closed his book, the heavy leather cover shutting with a quiet, dull thud. He set it on the small table beside his chair. "I cannot do that, Madeline," he said. "Why?" she cried, her voice cracking as she leaned forward, her fingers digging into the velvet of the sofa. "Why are you doing this to me? I am your wife, Julian. We built this life together. If my career goes down, we both go down. The mortgage, the car, our standing in this community, it all depends on this. Why are you destroying it over a simple speech? Over one missed thank you?" Julian looked down at his hands, then back at her. His gaze was steady, cold, and entirely free of the guilt or hesitation she was searching for. "I am not destroying anything, Madeline," he said, his voice level and smooth. You chose Carter's strategy. You told me that the narrative is what wins, not the footnotes. You told me that I worry too much about details that do not matter to the voters. You chose to present his raw data because it sounded better in your press releases. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. I am simply allowing you to run your campaign the way you and Carter designed it, he continued. If his strategy is as brilliant as you said it was, then you should have no problem spinning this with Higgins tomorrow morning. Madeline stared at him, her face turning a pale, sickly white. She looked at his calm posture, his clean desk, the dark, locked computer screen behind him. For the first time, she did not see a husband who was hurt or angry or waiting for an apology. She saw a stranger. She saw a man who had already checked out of the building, leaving the keys on the counter and the doors wide open for the winter wind to howl through. You don't care, she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. You don't care if I lose. You don't care if we lose the house. You don't care at all. Julian did not answer. He picked up his cold cup of tea, stood up, and walked past her out of the room. His steps were quiet, regular, and entirely unhurried as he headed toward the kitchen to pour the liquid down the sink. In the study, Madeline sat alone in the dark, her bare feet tucked under her, the silence of the large house pressing down on her like a physical weight. The morning light of the next day was thin and gray, filtered through a heavy bank of suburban fog that clung to the roofs of Oak Ridge Estates. At 6:15 a.m., the only sound inside the house was the quiet, rhythmic feeding of paper through the high-speed scanner on Julian's desk. The machine made a soft pneumatic whistle as each sheet of paper was drawn into its slot, followed by a faint green flash of light that illuminated the dark mahogany of his desk. Julian sat in his chair, his posture straight. Beside his elbow was a neat stack of bank statements dating back 3 years. On the floor stood a heavy, black plastic storage bin, its lid off, ready to receive the documents once they were digitized. He was systematically scanning every joint bank statement, credit card ledger, and tax return from the duration of Madeline's political rise. Using a yellow highlighter, he marked specific line items on the paper copies before feeding them into the scanner. These were not household expenses. They were transactions that Carter had assured Madeline were perfectly normal to run through a personal joint account to expedite the campaign's setup before the official bank accounts were certified by the state. A $3,000 transfer to a local catering company for the initial launch mixer. A $1,500 withdrawal labeled simply as petty cash for precinct volunteers. A $7,500 payment to Carter Sterling's consulting firm, processed 3 weeks before the official campaign account was registered with the county election board. Julian knew the local election laws by heart. He had memorized them 3 years ago when Madeline first whispered her ambitions to him in the quiet of their backyard. Under Section 12 of the State Municipal Election Code, any campaign expenditure exceeding $100 made from personal accounts without a written, notarized loan agreement registered within 48 hours was classified as an undocumented corporate donation. It was a misdemeanor for the candidate and a felony for the campaign manager if it was done with intent to bypass disclosure deadlines. There were 42 such transactions on the statements in front of him. Together, they totaled nearly $46,000 of Julian's hard-earned freelance income, spent without his written consent, routed through accounts that bore both of their names. He scanned the last page of the 2024 tax return. The green light of the scanner flickered, then died, leaving the room in its dim gray quiet once more. At 7:30, the floorboards upstairs groaned. A few minutes later, Madeline came down the stairs. She was already wearing a dark navy dress, but her movements were slow, almost heavy. Her eyes were swollen, and she had applied too much concealer under them in an attempt to hide the dark circles. She didn't look toward the study. She went straight to the kitchen, her heels making a muted thud on the floor. Julian listened. He heard the refrigerator door open, the sound of a plastic water bottle being pulled from the shelf, and then the quiet, metallic click of her keys being lifted from the counter. There was no sound of breakfast being prepared, no smell of coffee. A car horn sounded once from the driveway, a brief, impatient beep from Carter's Audi. Madeline's footsteps moved quickly toward the front door. The deadbolt clicked open, the heavy front door swung wide, and then it slammed shut, the vibration rattling the small silver photo frame on the entryway table. Julian did not stand up. He waited until the sound of Carter's engine had faded completely down the street. He reached for his phone, unlocked the screen, and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he had entered 3 days ago: Marcus Finch. Finch was not a flashy campaign attorney or a corporate lawyer. He was a quiet, gray-haired family law attorney whose office was located in a plain brick building next to the county courthouse. Julian had edited a legal manuscript for him 2 years ago, a dense technical guide on asset division in high-net-worth divorces. They had spent 3 hours discussing the subtle ways marital assets could be shielded or exposed during public litigation. Julian pressed the dial button. The phone rang twice before a gravelly, calm voice answered. Finch. "Marcus, this is Julian Vance," Julian said, his voice dropping into the quiet, measured tone he had used all morning. "Ah, Julian," Finch said, "I was wondering when I would hear from you. I saw the election results on the local news last night. Your wife had quite a victory." "It was a victory," Julian agreed. "I have the files we discussed on Tuesday, the bank statements, the tax returns, and the campaign ledgers. I have digitized all 42 of the personal expenditure transactions we identified." "And the total?" Finch asked. $46,320, Julian said. "None of them were registered as campaign loans. None of them have supporting documentation from the campaign treasurer. And they were all drawn from our joint account, which was funded 80% by my freelance retainers." Finch was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Julian could hear the faint sound of a pencil tapping against a legal pad. "That is a significant liability, Julian," Finch said. "If the state election board conducts a routine audit of her campaign finances, those transactions will trigger a formal inquiry. If she is already in office, it could lead to a censure or a forced resignation." "I am not interested in her resignation," Julian said, his eyes fixed on the highlighted line items on the paper in front of him. "I am interested in insulation." "Of course," Finch said. "The first step is filing the petition for separate maintenance and asset division. We will request a formal freeze on the joint savings and the immediate appraisal of the Oak Ridge property. Since you funded the mortgage and the car leases from your personal contracts, we will argue for a non-equal division of the equity to offset the unauthorized campaign expenditures." "How long to draft the petition?" Julian asked. "I can have it ready by 3 o'clock this afternoon," Finch said. "But Julian, once we file this, it becomes a matter of public record. Her political opponents, the local press, the county committee, they will all have access to the filing within 24 hours. Julian reached out with his silver rollerball pen. He drew a neat, precise circle around the final total on his summary sheet. "I am aware," Julian said. "I will see you at 3, Finch said, and hung up. Julian set the phone down. He stood up, picked up the paper statements, and placed them into the black plastic bin. He carried the bin down the hall to the garage, placing it in the very back of his sedan's trunk, beneath a spare tire cover, where no one would think to look. He looked at his watch. It was 8:15 a.m. Madeline's meeting with the county executive, Donald Higgins, was scheduled for 9:30 at the municipal building. Carter would be with her, armed with their raw database printouts and whatever empty political spin they had managed to draft on the drive over. Julian walked back into the house, closed the garage door, and sat down at the kitchen island. He poured himself a glass of cold water, took a slow drink, and began to wait. By 9:30 in the morning, the heavy gray fog had begun to lift, burning off under a bright, hot suburban sun that turned the wet lawns of Oak Ridge Estates into a shimmering sheet of green. Julian stood in the center of the living room. The silence of the house was absolute now. No longer a comfortable quiet, but the heavy, expectant stillness of an empty theater before the lights are turned off. He walked slowly to the limestone fireplace. On the mantel sat 3 framed photographs in matching silver-plated frames. The middle one was their wedding portrait, taken 12 years ago in a small historic chapel on the coast. Madeline was laughing, her veil blowing slightly across her face, while Julian stood beside her, looking stiff and slightly out of place in his dark suit. Julian picked up the frame. The silver was cool against his fingers. He turned it over, bent the small metal tabs back with his thumbnail, and slid the black velvet backing off. He pulled the photograph out, folded it twice with precise, sharp creases, and slid it into his breast pocket. He placed the empty silver frame back on the mantel, aligning it perfectly with the other 2 frames. The empty glass face of the frame caught the bright morning sun, reflecting a sharp, blinding glare across the white rug. At 10:15, his phone began to vibrate on the glass coffee table. It was Carter. The call lasted for 20 seconds before going to voicemail. A minute later, a text message appeared on the screen, the notification light blinking blue in the quiet room. "Julian," Carter wrote, "we are in the anteroom at Higgins' office. He is refusing to sign the transition protocol without the verified amortization schedule. He has his policy director in there with him, and they are comparing our raw printouts to the independent audit proposals. He is threatening to call a press conference for the noon news block. Answer your phone." Julian did not reply. He walked into the kitchen, took a small bag of whole coffee beans from the pantry, and poured them into the manual burr grinder. He liked the physical effort of the hand grinder. He held the wooden handle and began to turn it, a slow, steady rotation that produced a deep, rhythmic crunching sound. The rich, oily scent of dark roasted espresso filled the kitchen, masking the faint, lingering smell of the garlic and olive oil from the night before. As he ground the beans, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Madeline. "Julian, please," her text read. "Higgins is being incredibly stubborn. He says the raw database numbers we used show a 7% interest rate projection, which makes the whole project look like a tax drain. He wants the dynamic schedule you wrote. He said he knows you calculated the adjusted rates using the municipal bond margins. Just tell me where the file is. If you do not want to talk to me, text the file path to Carter. I am begging you." Julian stopped grinding. He lifted the lid of the grinder and breathed in the fresh, warm scent of the coffee grounds. He felt no hesitation, no sudden rush of sympathy. He looked at her use of the word begging. It was a word she had never used in their 12 years together. She did not know how to beg. Even in her text, it sounded like a strategic calculation, a rhetorical tool used to achieve a specific outcome. He poured the coffee grounds into the French press, added the hot water, and set the kitchen timer for 4 minutes. While the coffee steeped, Julian sat at the kitchen island with his laptop. He was not looking at her campaign documents. He was systematically decoupling his digital footprint from their shared household accounts. First, he opened the portal for the Oak Ridge Smart Home System. He logged into the administrator account, which was registered under his personal email. He removed Madeline's secondary access to the thermostat, the garage door controls, and the security cameras. He changed the primary administrative password to a 20-character random string. Next, he logged into the regional utility portal. He removed his bank account from the automatic billing cycle for the electricity, the water, and the high-speed internet. He set the accounts to manual paper billing, routing the invoices to Madeline's campaign email address. Finally, he opened their shared streaming and cloud storage accounts. He downloaded his personal photo archives, thousands of family pictures, travel documents, and digital receipts, before deleting his profile from the shared family plan. The kitchen timer buzzed, a sharp electronic beep that cut through the house. Julian pressed the plunger of the French press down with a slow, steady pressure. He poured the dark, steaming coffee into his favorite ceramic mug, added a splash of cold water to bring it to drinking temperature, and took a slow, appreciative sip. His phone lit up again. It was a news alert from the local daily paper's mobile app. "Zoning Board transition delayed," the headline read. "Newly elected Commissioner Madeline Vance faces questions over infrastructure budget discrepancies as County Executive Higgins delays transition protocol." Julian clicked on the article. It was short, written by Greg, the veteran reporter who had been at the victory party the night before. The piece quoted an anonymous source inside Higgins' office who claimed that Vance's campaign had presented unverified financial data that did not match the county's actual municipal bond projections. The article noted that if the discrepancies were not resolved by the end of the day, the state election board might be asked to review the transition filing. Julian scrolled to the bottom of the article. There was a photo of Madeline and Carter standing outside the municipal building, taken 20 minutes earlier. Madeline was looking down, her hand shielding her face from the camera, while Carter was pointing a finger at the photographer, his face tight with anger. Julian closed the app. He took another sip of his coffee. He calculated the exact timing of the collapse. The state election board met on Thursday mornings at 10. If Higgins did not sign the transition protocol by 5 p.m. today, the filing would be marked as incomplete, automatically triggering an administrative review during the Thursday session. Once the review began, the board would demand a full audit of all campaign expenditures and personal contributions to verify where the infrastructure funding models had originated. The 42 undocumented transactions he had scanned that morning would be sitting in their files, waiting like small, silent landmines. Julian finished his coffee, washed the French press in the sink, and wiped the granite counter until it was dry and smooth. He walked into his bedroom, opened his closet, and selected his best navy wool suit. He took his time dressing, ensuring his tie was perfectly knotted and his leather shoes were polished to a dull, professional shine. It was 12:45 p.m. His meeting with Marcus Finch was in 2 hours. He picked up his car keys from the table, walked past the empty silver frame on the mantel, and let himself out into the bright, silent afternoon. The heat of the early afternoon sun beat through the driver's side window of Julian's sedan, warming his left shoulder through the dark wool of his suit. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers tapping a slow, silent rhythm against the worn leather cover as he waited at the final traffic light before the downtown historic district. To his right, a large billboard for a local bank showed a smiling family in front of a colonial-style home. It was the same idealized suburban dream that Oak Ridge Estates sold to its residents, a dream that now felt as thin and fragile as a dried leaf. As he drove deeper into the downtown area, the wide, manicured streets of the suburbs gave way to narrower roads lined with red brick buildings from the 1920s. The air here was different, smelling of hot asphalt, damp river stone, and the exhaust of city buses. He parked in a small metered lot behind the county courthouse, feeding 3/4 into the mechanical slot of the iron meter. The indicator clicked, showing 1 hour of remaining time. Marcus Finch's office was located on the second floor of a 3-story brick building with frosted glass doors and a brass sign that had been polished so many times the edges of the letters were starting to soften. The lobby smelled of old floor wax, damp paper, and the sweet herbal scent of lavender hand soap from the shared restroom down the hall. Julian took the slow, heavy elevator to the second floor and walked down the carpeted hallway to suite 204. Finch's receptionist, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a neat cardigan, looked up from her desk with a polite smile. "Mr. Vance, Marcus is waiting for you in the conference room. You can go straight through." "Thank you," Julian said, his voice quiet. The conference room was small, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling wooden bookshelves filled with thick, leather-bound volumes of state court rulings. A slow-moving ceiling fan revolved overhead, its gentle whir cutting through the warm air. Marcus Finch sat at the head of a long mahogany table. He wore a gray tweed vest over a white shirt, his tie loosened slightly at the collar. In front of him was a neat blue folder and a thick stack of printed financial ledgers, the ones Julian had scanned and sent earlier that morning. "Julian," Finch said, rising to offer a firm, dry handshake. "Sit down." Julian pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and sat, placing his briefcase on the table beside him. "I reviewed the files you sent," Finch began, his voice dropping into the low, measured tone of a man who spent his life translating human disasters into legal code. "The financial audit is clear. The 42 transactions from your joint account directly violate the county's campaign disclosure laws. There is no paper trail registering these funds as personal loans, and because they were drawn from a joint account funded 80% by your personal contracts, we have a very strong case for what we call dissipation of marital assets. Finch tapped his finger on the blue folder. I have drafted the petition for separate maintenance and asset division, he continued. We are requesting an immediate freeze on the joint savings account, an appraisal of the Oak Ridge property, and a court-ordered separation of your personal debts from her campaign liabilities. Under the circumstances, we are also requesting that Madeline be held solely responsible for any fines, penalties, or legal fees arising from the campaign's financial irregularities. What is the timeline? Julian asked. Finch looked at the gold watch on his wrist. It is 2:15 p.m. My assistant is standing by at the county clerk's office. If you sign the petition now, we will file it at 3 o'clock. Once the clerk stamps the document, it becomes an official public filing. The bank will receive the freeze order on the joint account by 4 o'clock. And Madeline? Finch leaned back, his chair groaning softly. Her attorney will be served with the papers tomorrow morning. But because this is a public filing in a high-profile local race, the local media will likely have access to the court registry by 5 p.m. today. Greg, the reporter from the daily paper, monitors the clerk's new filings every afternoon before the printing deadline. Julian nodded. He reached into his breast pocket, took out his silver rollerball pen, and laid it on the table. The worn brass on the grip caught the yellow light of the conference room chandelier. He did not feel a sudden spike of anxiety. He did not feel the heavy, racing pulse of a man about to destroy his marriage. He felt only the clean, cold clarity of a calculation being brought to its logical conclusion. Is there any risk to my personal contracts? Julian asked. None, Finch said. We have kept your business accounts entirely separate in the filing. The corporate edit retainers are registered under your individual tax identification number, and because they were never commingled with her campaign account, she has no claim to them. You are legally insulated. Finch opened the blue folder, revealing 3 copies of the legal petition. Each copy was thick, bound with a heavy blue paper backing and a silver staple at the top. He pointed to the yellow signature flags at the bottom of the final pages. Sign here, here, and here, Finch said. Julian picked up his silver pen. He unscrewed the cap, set it on the table, and began to sign his name. His signature was small, precise, and identical on all 3 documents. The ink flowed smoothly from the tip of the pen, leaving a dark, wet trail on the heavy bond paper. As he signed the second copy, his phone began to vibrate inside his briefcase. The sound was muffled, a low, rhythmic rattle against the leather lining of the bag. It buzzed for 20 seconds, stopped, and then immediately began to buzz again. Finch looked at the briefcase, then back at Julian. His gray eyes were calm, showing no curiosity. He had seen hundreds of phones ring in this room, each one representing a desperate attempt by a spouse to halt a process that had already been set in motion. Let it ring, Julian said quietly. He finished signing the 3rd copy, screwed the cap back onto his pen, and slid it into his pocket. He pushed the blue folder back across the mahogany table. Finch picked up the documents, verifying each signature with a quick nod. He stood up, walked to the door, and handed the folder to his assistant, who was waiting in the hallway. "File it," Finch told her. The assistant nodded and walked quickly toward the elevator, her heels clicking on the tile floor. Finch walked back into the room, closing the door behind him. He sat back down and looked at Julian. "It is done, Julian," he said. "The process is official. By 5 p.m., the bank will freeze her campaign's access to your joint funds. By 6, she will find out that she can no longer use your savings to cover her campaign's transition costs or the fines from the Homeowners Association." Julian stood up, smoothing the lapels of his navy suit. "Thank you, Marcus," he said. "You should go home, Julian," Finch said, his voice gentle. "Or better yet, go to a hotel. Tonight is going to be very loud for her, and you do not need to be in the room when the roof falls in." Julian picked up his briefcase. "I have some packing to do," he said. "I will be at the house until 5. Finch nodded once, his expression solemn. "Take what is yours, Julian, because after today, nothing in that house will ever be the same." Julian walked out of the office, down the carpeted hall, and into the warm afternoon air of the street. His phone had finally stopped vibrating. He checked the screen as he walked to his car. There were 17 missed calls and 12 unread messages from Madeline and Carter. The final text from Carter was sent 5 minutes ago. "Higgins is pulling his endorsement," it read. "The daily paper is running the story in the morning edition." "Julian, where are you? We need to meet at the house now." Julian unlocked his car, climbed into the warm driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, smooth and steady. He pulled out of the parking lot, heading back toward the quiet, manicured streets of Oak Ridge Estates. The sound of the packing tape was incredibly loud in the high-ceilinged foyer of the Oak Ridge house. It was a sharp, tearing screech that cut through the silence like a physical blade, leaving a faint chemical smell of adhesive hanging in the warm afternoon air. Julian smoothed the clear tape down over the top of the cardboard box with the side of his hand, his thumb pressing the edges firmly against the brown cardboard. He had bought 3 standard shipping boxes from a postal supply store on his way back from Marcus Finch's office. He did not need many. Most of the furniture in the house had been chosen by Madeline's interior designer, paid for with the high-interest credit lines she had opened during her first year on the Homeowners Association board. He had no attachment to the white linen sofas, the chrome floor lamps, or the silk rugs that were too delicate to walk on with outdoor shoes. He was packing only what belonged to him. He went into his study, where the long shadows of the backyard pine trees were beginning to stretch across his desk. Methodically, he began to dismantle his workstation. He unplugged the power cables, wrapping them in neat circular coils secured with black twist ties. He lifted his vintage mechanical keyboard, the heavy gray and white board with the clicking keys that had drafted every speech, press release, and policy memo of her campaign, and placed it gently into a padded canvas sleeve. He packed his grandfather's gold pocket watch, which sat in a small velvet-lined dish on his shelf. He packed his collection of classic political biographies and his personal reference manuals. He packed his tax receipts, his freelance client ledger, and his spare notebooks. Everything fit into 2 boxes. He carried the first box down the hallway, his leather shoes silent on the hardwood, and placed it into the trunk of his sedan. The trunk was already holding the black plastic bin containing the scanned financial statements. He closed the trunk lid with a solid, muffled thud. At exactly 4 o'clock, his phone made a short, double-tone chime in his pocket. Julian pulled the device out and looked at the screen. It was a push notification from his banking application. "Account status update," the alert read. "Joint savings account ending in 8432 has been locked per temporary court order. Outbound transfers and debit transactions are suspended. Current balance $42,110. Julian swiped the notification away. The legal mechanism was working exactly as Marcus Finch had promised. The $34,000 he had moved to his personal account earlier that morning was safe, and the remaining funds in the joint account were now frozen, inaccessible to either of them until a judge ruled on the asset division. The phone began to ring 3 minutes later. Madeline's name flashed across the screen. Julian did not answer. He set the phone on the kitchen island, took a roll of packing tape, and walked back to the study to fetch the second box. The phone rang again. Then it stopped. Then a series of 3 text messages arrived in rapid succession, the vibration rattling the glass surface of the island. Julian carried the second box to his car, placed it in the back seat, and returned to the kitchen. He picked up the phone. There was a voicemail from Madeline. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Julian!" Her voice was a high, jagged streak of panic, completely stripped of her usual calculated poise. The background noise was loud, car horns, the roar of an engine, and the heavy breathing of someone who was running. "Julian, what did you do? I am at the regional printing office trying to pay the deposit for the emergency zoning response pamphlets, and my card was declined. The clerk said the transaction was blocked. I called the bank, and they told me there is a court-ordered freeze on the account. What is happening? Answer me." Julian did not call her back. He stood by the kitchen window, watching a small delivery truck drive slowly down the cul-de-sac, its brakes squealing softly as it stopped at a neighbor's house. At 4:12, the phone rang again. Julian swiped the green bar to answer. He held the phone to his ear but did not speak. He waited in the silence, letting her breathing fill the line first. "Julian?" Madeline gasped. Her voice was shaking, her words coming so fast they collided with one another. "Julian, thank God. Why is the account frozen? The bank manager said it is related to a legal petition filed in the county court this afternoon. What did you do? Tell me this is a mistake." "It is not a mistake, Madeline," Julian said. His voice was level, calm, and as quiet as the kitchen around him. "I filed a petition for separate maintenance and asset division at 3 o'clock. The freeze on the joint account is a standard legal procedure to protect the remaining marital assets from unauthorized dissipation." A long, dead silence fell over the line. Julian could hear the faint, distant hum of the highway through her phone, and then the sharp intake of her breath. "Asset division?" she whispered, the words sounding heavy and foreign in her mouth. Are you divorcing me, Julian? Over this? Over a campaign?" "I am separating our finances, Madeline," Julian said, "and I am insulating myself from the campaign finance violations you and Carter committed using our joint accounts." "You filed it in court?" Her voice suddenly spiked into a harsh, trembling scream. "Julian, that is a public record. Anyone can see it. Greg from the daily paper. He has been calling Carta's office every 10 minutes, asking about our transition funding. If he sees that filing, he will know about the personal accounts. It will be in the morning edition. It will ruin me." "The morning edition print deadline is 5:30, Julian said, his voice entirely free of malice, as if he were simply confirming a train schedule. "I imagine Greg is already writing the follow-up piece." "You planned this," she breathed, her voice dropping into a ragged, desperate whisper. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You waited until the day after the election. You waited until Higgins pulled his support. You wanted to destroy me when I was at my most vulnerable." "I did not write the raw database numbers for Higgins, Madeline," Julian said softly. "Carter did. And you chose to present them. I am simply stepping aside so you can manage the consequences of your choices." "I am coming home," she spat, her voice suddenly turning cold and venomous, a final, desperate attempt to reassert her authority. "I am coming home right now, and we are going to fix this. You are going to call your lawyer and withdraw that petition. Do you hear me, Julian? We are not doing this. I will not let you ruin my life because your feelings are hurt." She hung up before he could answer. Julian stood in the quiet kitchen, the phone still in his hand. He looked at his watch. It was 4:15 p.m. The drive from the regional printing office downtown to Oak Ridge Estates took approximately 25 minutes in afternoon traffic. She would be home by 4:40. He walked into his study one last time. He checked the drawers to make sure they were empty, then closed them gently. He picked up his briefcase, walked down the hall, and stepped out onto the front porch. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, casting long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns of the cul-de-sac. He locked the front door behind him, climbed into his sedan, and backed slowly out of the driveway, leaving the empty house behind. The lobby of the Oak River Suites was entirely beige, smelling of industrial lemon cleaner, stale coffee from a self-serve urn, and the cold, synthetic dampness of a commercial air conditioner running on high. Julian stood at the front desk, his leather briefcase resting on his polished shoes. The desk clerk, a young man wearing a polyester vest that was slightly too large for his narrow shoulders, tapped a series of keys on a flat-screen monitor. "Just one night, Mr. Vance?" the clerk asked, his voice flat with the standard neutrality of service workers at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. "One night for now," Julian said. His voice was quiet, matching the hush of the carpeted lobby. "I may extend it, depending on my schedule tomorrow." The clerk slid a thin, white plastic keycard across the laminate counter. "Room 312. It is on the top floor at the end of the hall, away from the ice machine. The elevators are just past the breakfast area." "Thank you," Julian said. He picked up his briefcase, took his room key, and walked toward the elevator. The metal doors opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss, and the cabin rose with a slow, heavy groan that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. Room 312 was identical to every other mid-range corporate hotel room in the county. It had a queen-size bed covered in a stiff, triple-sheeted white duvet, a dark wood desk with an adjustable desk lamp, and a small square window that looked out over a gravel parking lot and a row of tall pine trees separating the hotel from the highway. Julian placed his suitcase on the metal folding rack near the closet. He did not unpack his clothes. He simply took off his navy wool suit jacket, folded it carefully over the back of the desk chair, and sat down on the edge of the mattress. The bed was firm, smelling faintly of laundry bleach and cardboard. He took his phone out of his trouser pocket. He had turned the ringer off before entering the lobby, but the screen was a continuous scroll of blue notification lights. At 5:15 p.m., the local daily paper had updated its website. Julian opened the browser app on his phone and clicked the bookmark for the Oak Ridge Herald. The banner at the top of the homepage had been replaced with a thick red breaking news graphic. "Vance campaign fractures," the headline read. "Integrity of transition questioned as court filing reveals undeclared joint accounts." Julian clicked the link, scrolling slowly through the text. In a dramatic development following her election victory on Monday, newly elected Commissioner Madeline Vance faces potential administrative audits after her husband, Julian Vance, filed a petition for separate maintenance in the county court this afternoon, the article began. The piece written by Greg was meticulously detailed. Greg had obtained a complete copy of the court filing within minutes of its stamping by the clerk. The article listed the specific allegations Julian's petition had outlined: the 42 undocumented transactions totaling over $46,000 drawn from their joint personal account to fund campaign operations before the campaign's official banking credentials were approved by the state. The article quoted an anonymous legal expert who noted that if the allegations were proven, the expenditures could be classified as illegal corporate contributions, carrying severe administrative fines and potentially rendering the election results void under the state's Municipal Governance Act. Further down, the article addressed the infrastructure project. The financial disclosure comes on the heels of a closed-door meeting between Vance and County Executive Donald Higgins, who has reportedly suspended the transition protocol for the $60 million road project due to material interest rate discrepancies in Vance's campaign platform. Sources close to Higgins indicate that the executive will not sign the transition authority without a full, independent audit of the campaign's financial projections. Julian scrolled to the very end of the piece. There was a brief statement from Carter Sterling's public relations firm, released only 10 minutes ago. The filing by Mr. Vance is a private domestic matter and has no bearing on Commissioner Vance's commitment to the voters of Oak Ridge, the statement read. We are confident that any administrative questions regarding the campaign's early setup costs will be fully resolved during the routine audit process. Julian closed the app. He leaned back against the headboard of the bed, his eyes fixed on the blank white ceiling. The statement was exactly what he had expected from Carter, a weak, standard attempt to minimize the damage by calling it a domestic dispute. But Carter did not understand the timing of the state election board. The board's automated audit system would flag the court filing the moment the offices opened at 9 a.m. on Thursday. By 10, a formal request for documentation would be sent to the campaign treasurer. And the campaign treasurer had no documentation for those $46,000. Because Julian had the only copies of the joint statements, and they were currently locked in the trunk of his sedan in the gravel parking lot 3 floors below, his phone began to vibrate in his hand. The screen lit up with Carter's name. Julian let it ring until it went to voicemail, then immediately turned the phone completely off. He set the device face down on the nightstand, next to the small plastic tray containing an ice bucket and 2 paper cups wrapped in plastic. He sat in the silence of the room. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the pine trees, throwing long, thin bars of orange light across the beige carpet. The highway in the distance was a continuous, dull hum, the sound of hundreds of people heading home to their quiet suburban developments, their perfect lawns, and their locked garages. Julian closed his eyes. For 12 years, his mind had been a constant, crowded ledger of Madeline's needs, her schedule, her public image, and her administrative details. He had lived in the space between her ambition and her reality, constantly patching the holes before the world could see them. Now that space was empty. He felt no regret. He felt no anger toward her, or toward Carter, or toward the system that had used his invisible labor to build a hollow monument to her success. He felt only the profound clinical peace of a physical mass that had stopped moving. He stood up, walked to the small bathroom, and splashed cold water on his face. The reflection in the mirror was the same as it had been that morning, calm, tired, but entirely clear. He walked back to the desk, pulled his laptop from his briefcase, and opened a clean, blank document. He began to draft a short, formal email to his freelance clients, letting them know that his temporary administrative availability had concluded and that he was now accepting new project editing contracts for the summer quarter. He was going to be very busy. The small digital clock on the hotel nightstand glowed with a dim green light. 8:45 p.m. Outside the window, a light rain had begun to fall, a steady, whispering patter that streaked the glass with thin, dark lines of water, reflecting the orange security lights of the parking lot below. Julian sat at the desk in his room, his laptop open. Beside his hand was a paper cup filled with hot chamomile tea, the steam rising to condense on the bottom of the adjustable desk lamp. He was in the middle of editing a technical manual on hazardous waste disposal for a chemical manufacturing client. It was dry, repetitive work, requiring him to verify hundreds of specific federal regulatory citations. He found it comforting. In the structured world of federal code, there was no room for interpretation, no space for narrative or spin. A protocol was either compliant or it was not. At 9:12, a small gray notification window slid into the upper right corner of his laptop screen. Legacy Drive Security Alert, the notification read. Unauthorized activity detected on shared directory, Vance_campaign_legal. Julian paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. The shared directory was a legacy cloud folder he had created 18 months ago during the initial phase of Madeline's campaign. He had used it to store draft bylaws, volunteer waiver forms, and basic compliance templates. He had assumed she had forgotten the folder existed, as she had never personally logged into it, preferring to have Julian email her the finished documents whenever she needed them. But the session key used to access the folder belonged to Madeline's personal laptop, a device that still retained cached login credentials from their shared home network. Julian clicked on the security log, opening the live audit trail. The IP address of the user was 68.142.89.2. It was the static fiber optic line assigned to their home in Oak Ridge Estates. He watched the screen. In the quiet hotel room, The only sound was the low electric hum of the mini-fridge and the soft, rhythmic patter of the rain against the glass. The audit log updated in real time. User changed directory to archive_contracts. User downloaded file 2024_tax_homestead_signed.pdf. User uploaded file Vance_personal_agreement_signed.pdf. Julian leaned back in his chair. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, the warm liquid soothing his throat. His breathing remained slow and steady. He felt no sudden jolt of adrenaline, no tightness in his chest. He clicked on the newly uploaded file and downloaded it to his local drive. The document was 3 pages long. It was printed on campaign letterhead, a template Julian had designed himself the previous summer. The text was a standard promissory note stating that Julian Vance had agreed to provide up to $50,000 in personal, interest-free loans to the Vance for Council campaign, with a maturity date of December 2026. The document was backdated to March 14, 2025, the day before the first undocumented $30,000 transfer had been made from their joint account. Julian scrolled to the final page. There were 2 signature lines. Madeline's signature was her usual wide, looping cursive, signed in black ink. Beside it was Julian's signature. Julian leaned closer to the screen, analyzing the digital image of his name. The stroke of the J was slightly jagged, with a tiny 3-pixel flat spot on the bottom curve. It was an exact pixel-for-pixel match of the signature on the 2024 property tax exemption form he had scanned for her 6 months ago. He had used a cheap flatbed scanner at the local library that day, which had left a microscopic line of dust on the glass, creating that identical flat spot on the bottom of his J. They had copied the digital signature from the tax document, cleaned the edges with basic image editing software, and pasted it onto the forged loan agreement. They had done it tonight in his study, sitting at his desk. Julian clicked on the file's metadata. The author of the PDF document was registered as Carter Sterling's campaign laptop. The file had been created at 8:36 p.m. and exported as a flattened PDF to prevent any simple digital analysis of the image layers. But they had forgotten to clear the system metadata. Julian took a screen recording of the cloud audit log, showing the Oak Ridge IP address, the precise timestamps of the tax document download, and the immediate upload of the forged contract. He exported the security log as a verified CSV file, securing the digital signatures of the server transfer. He opened his email and drafted a message to Marcus Finch. Marcus, the email read, "At 8:36 p.m. tonight, Madeline and Carter used my home network to access my legacy cloud drive. They downloaded a document containing my digitized signature and used it to fabricate a backdated personal loan agreement for $46,000. They have uploaded this forged document to our legacy shared directory. I have attached the security logs, the metadata report, and the forged document itself." He clicked Attach, selected the files, and hovered his cursor over the send button. He made a silent calculation of their desperation. They knew that the state election board's automated audit would begin at 9 a.m. on Thursday. They knew that Higgins would not sign the transition authority without proof of funding compliance. If they could present Higgins with a signed, backdated loan agreement by tomorrow morning, they might salvage the endorsement and delay the state board's investigation. Carter had likely convinced her it was a minor risk. He had probably told her that spouses do not sue each other over campaign documents, and that even if Julian discovered the forgery, he would never go public with it because it would destroy their shared financial standing. They had crossed the line from sloppy, negligent accounting into active criminal forgery. Julian pressed the send button. The email vanished from his screen with a soft digital whoosh. He closed his laptop, slid it into his briefcase, and stood up. He walked to the window, looking out into the dark, wet night. The rain was coming down harder now, washing over the gravel parking lot, turning the pine trees into dark, shivering shapes against the gray sky. He felt a deep, profound sense of finality. The trap was no longer financial. It was no longer a domestic dispute about money or credit or unappreciated labor. By forging his signature on a legal contract to satisfy a municipal compliance requirement, they had handed him the ultimate instrument of leverage. He picked up his teacup, walked to the bathroom, and poured the cold dregs into the sink. He was going to sleep well tonight. The hum of the hotel air conditioner was a low, dry vibration that seemed to seep into the very walls of room 312. By 11:30 p.m., the rain had settled into a steady gray drizzle, washing the orange glare of the highway lights into a dull, blurry smear against the window pane. Julian lay on his back in the dark, his eyes open, watching the faint reflection of the digital clock numbers shift across the white ceiling. He had not fallen asleep immediately. He had spent the last 2 hours listening to the occasional distant roar of a semi-truck passing on the interstate, its heavy tires making a wet, tearing sound on the slick asphalt. At 11:42, his phone, which sat face down on the laminate nightstand, buzzed twice. Julian rolled over, picked up the device, and turned the screen brightness down to its lowest setting. It was an email from Marcus Finch. "Julian," the lawyer wrote, "I have reviewed the cloud security logs, the metadata, and the PDF you forwarded. The evidence of digital manipulation is absolute. The file structure indicates the signature was lifted from the 2024 tax document and placed onto the agreement using a vector editing tool on Carter Sterling's laptop. This is a significant escalation." Under Section 18 of the State Criminal Code, fabricating a signature on a financial disclosure document intended for a public official is classified as forgery in the second degree. Finch had added a second paragraph, his legal advice cold and precise. Do not delete the cloud logs. Do not lock them out of the legacy folder. If we confront them tonight, they will claim it was a clerical draft or a technical error, and they will delete the file before the server audit trail is certified. For the criminal charge of uttering a forged instrument to attach, they must actively present this document to a public authority to secure a benefit. If they present this forged loan agreement to County Executive Higgins' office tomorrow morning to bypass the transition freeze, The act is complete and irreversible. Let them proceed." Julian read the email twice. He did not reply. He set the phone back on the nightstand, closed his eyes, and let his breathing settle back into a slow, regular rhythm. He woke at 6:15 a.m., precisely when the gray morning light began to turn the window pane from black to a pale, wet silver. He did not use the hotel alarm. His internal clock, trained by years of waking early to manage Madeline's frantic morning schedules, was flawless. He sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the mattress, and stood on the thin, cold carpet. He walked to the window. The rain had finally stopped, but the trees below were still dripping, the pine needles dark and heavy with moisture. In the gravel lot, his gray sedan sat quietly, its surface covered in a thin sheet of morning condensation. Julian dressed slowly. He chose a fresh white shirt from his suitcase, his movements methodical and quiet. He did not put on his suit jacket. He sat at the small wood desk in his shirt sleeves, turned on the single-cup coffee maker on the vanity, and watched the dark, hot liquid drip into a paper cup. At 6:45, his phone buzzed. He picked it up. It was Marcus Finch. "Julian," Finch said, his gravelly voice sounding alert despite the early hour. "Are you awake?" "I am awake," Julian said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. The taste was cheap, slightly burnt, but the warmth was grounding. "I have just spoken with an assistant in the county attorney's office," Finch said. "Higgins, as policy director, has scheduled an emergency meeting with Madeline and Carter at 8:30 a.m. in the municipal building. Carter called them at midnight, claiming they had found the misplaced loan documentation and would present the signed agreement to verify the funding." "They are going to use it," Julian said. "Yes," Finch said. "They are going to present the forged document to the policy director to lift the transition hold before the state board's 9 a.m. audit cycle begins. Once they hand that paper over, the county attorney's office is legally required to verify the authenticity of the signature if there is a dispute. And we are going to dispute it. How long after they present it do we file the affidavit of non-authorization?" Julian asked. Finch let out a slow, dry chuckle. "My assistant will be sitting in the county attorney's reception area at 8:15. The moment Madeline and Carter walk into the inner office with the document, we will file the verified affidavit stating that you never authorized, signed, or had knowledge of the loan agreement. We will attach the digital forensic report of the signature forgery." Finch paused, his tone shifting into a lower, more serious key. "Julian, once we do this, the county attorney has no choice but to refer the matter to the sheriff's department for a criminal inquiry. It will not be an administrative audit anymore. It will be a criminal investigation for forgery and public fraud. There is no turning back from this. Your wife will likely be arrested." Julian looked out the window. A lone crow had landed on the roof of his gray sedan, its black feathers sleek and wet in the pale morning light. It tilted its head, looking at its own reflection in the glass of the windshield. "She is not my wife," Julian said, his voice level and cool. "She is a candidate who chose to forge a legal contract to protect her career." "Understood," Finch said. "I will have my assistant proceed at 8:30. I will call you the moment the affidavit is stamped and served on the county attorney." "Thank you, Marcus," Julian said. He hung up, set the phone on the desk, and took another sip of his coffee. He felt no surge of triumph, no dramatic rush of satisfaction. His mind was entirely occupied with the physical mechanics of the day. He thought about the $50 daily fine from the Homeowners Association, which would now be the sole responsibility of Madeline's personal estate once the asset division was finalized. He thought about the Porsche lease, which would likely default within 30 days when her campaign accounts were suspended by the state board. He opened his laptop, checked his client folders, and began to work on a fresh set of editing proofs for his engineering client. In the quiet hotel room, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard and the distant, steady hum of the morning commuters on the highway, completely unaware of the quiet, legal execution about to take place 3 miles away. The hands of the analog watch on Julian's wrist moved with a silent, gliding precision. It was 8:15 a.m. Julian sat at the wood desk in room 312, his fingers resting lightly on the plastic edge of his laptop. On the screen, a document on wastewater treatment standards was half-edited, a red correction line cutting through a paragraph on containment barriers. He was not typing. He was looking at the small digital clock in the corner of his monitor. 8:20. 8:25. He knew the layout of the county municipal building perfectly. He had spent 3 years managing Madeline's appointments there, mapping her routes through the security checkpoints to ensure she arrived at her committee hearings exactly 5 minutes before the scheduled gavel. At this exact moment, Madeline and Carter would be stepping out of the elevator on the 4th floor. Carter would be carrying his leather briefcase, his face smooth, his posture confident. Madeline would be wearing her navy dress, her heels clicking sharply on the terrazzo floor as they walked toward the policy director's office at the end of the hall. 8:30. Julian picked up his paper cup of lukewarm tea. He took a small sip, letting the herbal bitterness settle on his tongue. His phone, sitting on the green blotter next to his mouse, vibrated once. It was a text message from Marcus Finch's assistant. "Affidavit filed with the clerk of the court," the message read. "Served to the county attorney's office at 8:32 a.m. Verification of service complete." Julian set his cup down, his hand steady. At 8:40, the phone began to ring. It was Marcus Finch. Julian swiped the green bar and held the phone to his ear, his back leaning slightly against the wooden back of the desk chair. "It is done, Julian," Finch said. His voice was low, carrying the quiet gravity of a done deal. "My assistant was in the reception area when they entered the inner office. She witnessed Carter hand a manila envelope to the policy director. 5 minutes later, the county attorney's representative walked into the room with our served affidavit." "What happened?" Julian asked quietly. "The policy director suspended the meeting immediately," Finch said. "They locked the conference room door. The county attorney's office has taken possession of the physical loan agreement as evidence. Because the document contains a forged signature intended to secure a public administrative benefit, the county attorney has officially referred the matter to the county sheriff's white-collar fraud division. Are they still in the building?" "They are," Finch said. "They are being held in the small conference room on the 4th floor while the deputies verify the filing details." Julian, the county attorney's representative, told Carter that if the signature is proven to be unauthorized, they will be facing charges of forgery and public filing fraud. Carter tried to claim it was a domestic misunderstanding, but the county attorney pointed to your notarized affidavit. There is no misunderstanding when a notary is involved. Thank you, Marcus, Julian said. Keep your phone on, Julian, Finch added. They are going to try to reach you. The sheriff's office may also call to verify your statement, but they have the forensic audit of the digital signature. The evidence is self-sustaining. Julian hung up. He set the phone back on the desk and stood up, walking to the window. The morning sun had finally broken through the gray clouds, casting a bright, harsh light over the wet pine trees. The water on the needles was evaporating, turning into a thin white mist that rose slowly toward the blue sky. At 9:15, the phone began to ring again. The screen lit up with Madeline's contact photo. Julian let it ring for 3 cycles before he swiped the screen. He held the phone to his ear. He did not say hello. He waited, his chest rising and falling in a slow, silent rhythm. Julian? Her voice was a ragged, breathless whisper. She was hiding. He could hear the distinct hollow echo of a tiled public restroom in the background, the distant roar of a hand dryer running on a timer. She was crying, her breath coming in short, gasping wheezes that sounded like she was choking. "Julian, please," she sobbed, her voice dropping into a desperate, frantic plead. "You have to call them. You have to call the county attorney right now. They are holding us in the conference room. 2 deputies are standing outside the door. They have the loan agreement, Julian. They said it is a forgery." Julian did not answer. He listened to the wet, choking sound of her panic. "Carter is trying to call his firm's lawyers," she continued, her words tumbling over one another in a frantic, desperate rush. "But they said because it is a criminal inquiry, the campaign lawyers cannot represent us personally. Julian, they are talking about handcuffs. They are talking about a felony. Please, just tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you forgot that you signed it. Tell them you gave us permission to use the digital signature." "I cannot do that, Madeline," Julian said. His voice was quiet, even, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Why?" she shrieked, her voice cracking, her whisper turning into a harsh, echoing scream in the tiled room. "Why are you doing this? It was just a signature. We did it to save the transition. If they arrest me, Julian, my life is over. The seat is gone. The house is gone. Everything we built for 12 years. It will all be in the papers by noon. You did it to save your career, Madeline," Julian said softly, "and you did it without my consent. You used my name, my credit, and my labor to build your platform, and then you copied my signature to cover your deficit. I am not going to lie to a sheriff's deputy to protect Carter's strategy." "Julian," she gasped, her voice turning into a raw, helpless plea. "Please, I am your wife. We are family. You can't let them do this to me." "I am not doing anything to you, Madeline," Julian said. "You and Carter uploaded that document last night. You presented it to Higgins' office this morning. I am simply standing in the light and letting the machine you built run its course." He lowered the phone. "Julian, no, please!" "Julian!" He pressed the red button, cutting her voice off in the middle of her scream. The room went instantly, beautifully silent. Julian stood by the window, the small phone cool in his palm. He looked at his watch. It was 9:20 a.m. The county sheriff's department was located on the first floor of the same municipal building. It would take the deputies approximately 3 minutes to walk up the stairs to the fourth-floor conference room with the warrants. He walked back to the desk, sat down in his shirt sleeves, and opened his laptop. He selected the paragraph on wastewater containment barriers, deleted 3 unnecessary words, and replaced them with a single, precise semicolon. The work was clean. The work was quiet. The morning sun of Saturday was warm, filtering through the clean, tall glass windows of a small wood-frame cottage 30 miles north of the Oak Ridge cul-de-sac. Julian stood on the back porch, his fingers wrapped around a heavy, dark clay mug of fresh coffee. There was no hum of central air conditioning here, no rhythmic hiss-click of automatic sprinklers, and no distant roar of the interstate. Instead, the air smelled of damp pine needles, wild clover, and the cool, clean water of the lake that sat 50 yards from his steps. A soft breeze ruffled the leaves of the old oak trees, a gentle, natural sound that seemed to ease the lingering tension in his shoulders. He had rented the cottage for the summer. It was a modest, quiet place with a stone fireplace, a single wooden desk, and a screen door that squeaked slightly when it closed. On the pine table inside lay a thick, white courier envelope from Marcus Finch's office, delivered late the previous evening. Julian had read the contents once, his eyes moving slowly over the dry, legal phrasing, before he set the papers down and walked out to the porch. The collapse of Madeline's campaign had been swift, public, and absolute. According to the legal documents, the county sheriff's department had executed their warrants within 20 minutes of Julian's affidavit being served. Madeline and Carter had been escorted from the fourth-floor conference room of the municipal building through the side entrance, but the local media, alerted by Greg's continuous updates, had been waiting at the curb. The evening broadcast had shown a 5-second clip of Madeline walking toward a sheriff's vehicle, her face pale and shielded by her hand, while Carter shouted at a reporter to turn off his camera. By Thursday morning, the state election board had formally suspended the transition process, launching an official inquiry into her campaign finances. Without the dynamic amortization schedule that Julian had deleted, and with the joint savings account frozen by court order, the campaign was unable to pay its suppliers or clear its outstanding debts. The leasing company had already repossessed her silver Porsche Cayenne from the driveway of the empty Oak Ridge house, the vehicle towed away on a flatbed trailer while the neighbors watched from behind their plantation shutters. The county committee had released a brief 3-sentence statement on Friday, formally withdrawing their endorsement of Madeline Vance and demanding her immediate resignation from the transition committee. Her political career, built so carefully on a foundation of his silent labor, had vanished in less than 48 hours. Marcus Finch's cover letter noted that Madeline's criminal defense attorney had already approached them, offering a complete, non-contested division of the Oak Ridge property and a waiver of all claims to Julian's personal freelance income if he would agree to soften his testimony regarding the digital signature. Julian had written his response at the bottom of the letter in his neat architectural hand. "We will proceed with the court filing as written. No modifications." He took a slow drink of his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. He felt no anger toward Madeline, nor did he feel the bitter satisfaction of revenge. What he felt was something much deeper, a profound, quiet release. For 12 years, his life had been a series of corrections, a continuous, invisible effort to hold up a structure that was never meant to stand. He had written her speeches, managed her anxieties, and shielded her from her own limitations, only to be cast aside when she believed she no longer needed his image. The suffering of those quiet, overlooked years had not been in vain. It had been a long, slow education, teaching him the absolute value of his own quiet strength. He looked out over the water, where a family of wild ducks was swimming in a neat V-shaped line across the glass-like surface of the lake. The mother duck moved with a slow, steady rhythm, her small ducklings following her lead without a sound. It was a simple, honest scene, entirely free of theater, completely devoid of vanity. If this story reminded you that true devotion should never be taken for granted, and that those who work quietly in the shadows often carry the heaviest loads, you are not alone. Sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones we fail to see, and when their invisible support is finally withdrawn, we realize too late that we cannot stand on our own. What would you have done if you were in Julian's position? Would you have stayed silent for as long as he did? Or would you have walked away the moment you felt your dignity being compromised? Share your thoughts and your own stories of resilience, family, and second chances in the comments below. If you enjoy deep, meaningful family dramas that explore the quiet power of truth, self-respect, and justice, please consider subscribing to the channel. We share stories that remind us that our choices have consequences, and that a life built on honesty is always stronger than one built on public applause. Julian set his clay mug down on the wooden railing of the porch. He walked back inside the cottage, the screen door closing behind him with a soft, familiar creak. He sat at his wooden desk, opened his laptop, and looked at the clean, blank page waiting for his next client project. The cursor blinked slowly, a steady, patient green light in the quiet room. He reached for his silver rollerball pen, placed it neatly on the desk blotter, and began to write. Because in the end, the most beautiful speeches are not the ones spoken under the glare of public lights, but the silent, honest lives we write for ourselves in the quiet of the morning.